The collapse of late Bronze Age palatial systems across Europe around 1200 BC created a vacuum that fundamentally altered the trajectory of Central European societies. As the Mycenaean palaces fell silent and Mediterranean trade networks fragmented, communities north of the Alps found themselves increasingly isolated from southern influences, yet paradoxically more self-reliant. The Urnfield culture, which had dominated much of Central Europe during the Late Bronze Age, began experiencing internal transformations that would eventually crystallise into what archaeologists recognise as the Hallstatt culture. The Urnfield tradition, characterised by cremation burials in large ceramic vessels and extensive bronze-working capabilities, had established sophisticated networks of exchange and production across the region. However, mounting evidence suggests that by 1200 BC, these communities faced significant environmental and social pressures. Climatic data from alpine ice cores and pollen analysis indicate a period of cooling and increased precipitation, which would have affected agricultural yields and settlement patterns. Simultaneously, the disruption of long-distance trade routes meant that access to tin, essential for bronze production, became increasingly unreliable and expensive. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Stilfried in Austria and Velký Grob in Slovakia reveals a gradual shift in material culture during the 12th and 11th centuries BC. Bronze objects became smaller and more utilitarian, while pottery styles began incorporating new decorative motifs that departed from traditional Urnfield patterns. More significantly, iron objects began appearing in archaeological contexts, initially as prestige items, but gradually becoming more common in everyday assemblages. The earliest iron artifacts in the region include simple knives and pins, often found alongside traditional bronze implements, suggesting a transitional period where both technologies coexisted. The geographic heartland of the emerging Hallstatt culture encompassed a vast territory stretching from the Eastern Alps through Bohemia and into portions of the Carpathian Basin. This region possessed several crucial advantages that facilitated cultural development. The Eastern Alps contained rich deposits of iron ore, particularly in areas that would later become synonymous with Hallstatt prosperity, such as the Salzkammergut region of Austria. The Bohemian Massif offered additional mineral resources including silver and copper, while the river systems of the Danube, Rhine and Elbe provided natural corridors for communication and exchange. Within this geographic framework, distinct regional variations began emerging that would characterise the early Hallstatt phases. In the Alpine regions, communities developed specialised knowledge of iron extraction and processing techniques. Archaeological excavations at Magdalensberg in Carinthia have revealed evidence of ironworking activities dating to the 10th century BC, including furnace remains and slag deposits that indicate sophisticated understanding of smelting processes. The iron ore in this region had a relatively high quality, containing fewer impurities than ores found elsewhere in Europe, which gave local smiths distinct advantages in producing superior tools and weapons. The transition from bronze to iron technology occurred gradually and unevenly across the region. Bronze continued to play important roles in decorative objects, religious items, and status symbols well into the Hallstatt period. However, iron's practical advantages for everyday tools became increasingly apparent. Iron tools maintained sharper edges longer than bronze implements, and the raw materials were more readily available locally, reducing dependence on long-distance trade networks. Early Hallstatt smiths developed techniques for carburizing iron surfaces, creating steel-like properties and cutting edges while maintaining softer, more workable cores. The process of ironworking in early Hallstatt communities involved several stages that required specialised knowledge and equipment. Ore extraction typically occurred in open-pit mines or shallow shafts, with evidence of systematic mining operations found at sites like Hüttenberg in Austria. The extracted ore underwent initial processing to remove obvious impurities before being transported to smelting sites, often located near reliable sources of fuel and water. Smelting furnaces from this period were relatively simple bowl-shaped structures lined with clay, capable of reaching temperatures around 1200 degrees Celsius through the use of bellows systems. Pottery production during the early Hallstatt period reflected both continuity with Urnfield traditions and innovation in response to changing social needs. The characteristic Hallstatt pottery of phases A and B displayed distinctive decorative schemes that departed significantly from late Bronze Age styles. Geometric patterns dominated, featuring combinations of incised lines, impressed dots, and applied cordons that created complex visual rhythms across vessel surfaces. The pottery from Gemeinlebarn in Lower Austria exemplifies these developments, with vessels showing sophisticated understanding of proportional relationships and surface treatment techniques. Burial practices underwent significant transformations that would become defining characteristics of Hallstatt culture. While cremation remained the predominant burial rite, continuing Urnfield traditions, the treatment of cremated remains and associated grave goods began reflecting new social hierarchies and belief systems. Early Hallstatt burials often featured iron objects placed alongside traditional bronze items, suggesting that iron had acquired symbolic as well as practical significance. The cemetery at Klein in Styria provides excellent examples of these transitional burial practices, with graves containing combinations of iron knives, bronze ornaments, and distinctive pottery vessels. The development of settlement patterns during this formative period reveals increasing social stratification and economic specialization. Hilltop fortifications became more common, suggesting either increased warfare or the need to protect valuable resources and populations. The fortified settlement at Hoeneberg, though reaching its greatest prominence later, shows evidence of occupation beginning in the early Hallstatt period. These elevated sites often controlled strategic positions overlooking river valleys or mountain passes, indicating their importance in regional communication and trade networks. Agricultural practices during the early Hallstatt period built upon late Bronze Age foundations, while adapting to changing environmental conditions. Paleobotanical evidence from sites across the region indicates continued cultivation of wheat, barley, and millet, supplemented by increasing emphasis on livestock raising. The cooling climate may have favoured pastoral activities over intensive agriculture in some areas, contributing to the mobile lifestyle that characterised many early Hallstatt communities. Animal bone assemblages from sites like Stillfried show high percentages of cattle, sheep, and pigs, with cattle bones often showing evidence of use for traction, indicating the importance of ploughing and transportation. Social organisation during this period appears to have been based on kinship groups and emerging warrior elites, who controlled access to ironworking technology and long-distance exchange relationships. The distribution of iron objects in early Hallstatt contexts suggests that metalworking knowledge was closely guarded, and that smiths held elevated social positions. Evidence from workshop areas at various sites indicates that ironworking often occurred in specialised areas of settlements, sometimes associated with evidence of ritual activities that may have been connected to the transformation of raw materials into finished products. The emergence of distinctive artistic styles during phases A and B reflected both local innovations and continued connections to broader European cultural developments. Bronze work from this period shows increasing sophistication in casting techniques and decorative schemes. The famous bronze vessels from graves at Stretweg and other sites demonstrate mastery of complex multi-part casting and sophisticated understanding of metallurgical properties. These objects often featured narrative scenes that provide insights into early Hallstatt religious beliefs and social practices, though their precise meanings remain subjects of scholarly debate. Regional variations within the early Hallstatt culture area became increasingly pronounced as communities adapted to local resources and conditions. In Bohemia, the abundance of silver deposits influenced local material culture, with silver ornaments becoming more common than in other regions. The Carpathian Basin communities developed distinctive pottery styles that incorporated influences from neighbouring cultures while maintaining core Hallstatt characteristics. These regional differences would become more pronounced in later periods. but their roots lay in the adaptive strategies developed during the formative centuries of Hallstatt culture. The technological innovations of the early Hallstatt period extended beyond metallurgy to include advances in textile production, woodworking and other crafts. Preserved organic materials from waterlogged sites provide evidence of sophisticated weaving techniques and complex textile patterns. Wooden artifacts show advanced carpentry skills and understanding of different wood properties for specific applications. These technological developments supported increasingly complex social and economic systems that would reach full maturity in the later Hallstatt phases. By 800 BC, the technological and social foundations established during the early Hallstatt period had created the preconditions for an economic transformation that would reshape Central Europe. The communities scattered across the Alpine regions possessed sophisticated iron-working capabilities, established settlement hierarchies, and emerging networks of regional exchange. However, it was the systematic exploitation of a single natural resource that would catapult these societies into unprecedented prosperity and establish them as crucial intermediaries in continental trade networks. The Salzkammergut region of Upper Austria contained salt deposits of extraordinary quality and accessibility that had formed through geological processes spanning millions of years. These deposits, concentrated primarily around what is now Hallstatt and Bad Ischl, represented layers of evaporated seawater from ancient marine environments that had been compressed and preserved beneath layers of rock and sediment. The salt occurred in massive crystalline formations that could be extracted through mining techniques, unlike the surface salt deposits found in other parts of Europe that required evaporation of brine solutions. Archaeological investigations in the Hallstatt salt mines have revealed evidence of systematic extraction beginning around 800 BC, though smaller scale activities may have occurred earlier. The mining operations required sophisticated understanding of underground conditions, structural engineering and workforce organisation. Miners worked in narrow galleries that followed the salt veins deep into the mountainside, using techniques that maximised extraction while maintaining tunnel stability. The preserved wooden infrastructure found in these mines provides extraordinary insights into early medieval engineering capabilities. The mining tools recovered from the Hallstatt excavations demonstrate remarkable preservation due to the salt environment's natural mummification properties. Bronze-bladed picks with wooden handles show wear patterns indicating intensive use, while leather bags and wooden carrying containers reveal the methods used to transport extracted salt to surface processing areas. Rope fragments made from twisted plant fibres indicate sophisticated knowledge of load-bearing requirements for hauling materials through narrow passages. The wooden support timbers, many still in their original positions, display advanced carpentry techniques, including precise joinery and calculated load distribution. Salt extraction required coordinated labour forces working in dangerous underground conditions. Evidence suggests that mining crews worked in shifts, with different groups responsible for excavation, transport, and surface processing. The narrow galleries, typically measuring between 1 and 2 metres in height and width, required miners to work in cramped positions while maintaining productivity levels necessary to meet growing demand. Ventilation systems using wooden channels and strategic openings provided fresh air circulation, while drainage systems managed groundwater infiltration that could flood working areas. The processing of extracted rock salt involved crushing, sorting and packaging operations that occurred at surface facilities near the mine entrances. Archaeological remains of these processing areas include stone grinding surfaces, wooden sorting tables, and storage structures that could accommodate large quantities of finished salt. The final product was packaged in standardized containers that facilitated long-distance transport and trade calculations. Evidence suggests that different grades of salt were produced, with the finest crystalline varieties reserved for high-value trade relationships, while coarser grades served local and regional markets. The economic implications of large-scale salt production extended far beyond the immediate mining communities. Salt represented one of the few commodities that combined universal demand with limited geographic availability. creating ideal conditions for profitable long-distance trade. Unlike iron ore or agricultural products, which could be found in many regions, high-quality rock salt deposits were rare and concentrated in specific geological formations. This scarcity gave Hallstatt communities enormous leverage in establishing trade relationships across vast distances. The establishment of trade networks radiating outward from the alpine salt-producing regions required sophisticated organisational capabilities and diplomatic relationships with numerous intervening communities. Archaeological evidence traces these networks through the distribution of distinctive Hallstatt artefacts found at sites stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean coast. Bronze vessels manufactured in Hallstatt workshops have been discovered in elite burials across Central and Western Europe, indicating that salt wealth enabled the production of luxury goods that served as diplomatic gifts and trade facilitators. The northern trade routes connected the Alpine regions to Baltic amber sources through a series of river valleys and overland passages. The Danube river system provided the primary corridor for eastward movement, while tributaries like the Inn and Salzach rivers offered access to northern watersheds leading toward the Baltic drainage basin. Archaeological sites along these routes show evidence of Hallstatt presence through distinctive pottery styles, metalwork and burial practices that indicate either direct Hallstatt settlement or strong cultural influence through trade relationships. Excavations at sites like Bisi Skala in Moravia have revealed evidence of substantial Hallstatt trading posts that served as intermediary centres for northern trade. These sites contained large quantities of salt residue in storage areas, along with amber artefacts and northern European pottery styles that indicate active exchange relationships. The strategic positioning of these trading centres at river confluences and mountain passes demonstrates sophisticated understanding of transportation logistics and regional geography. The Mediterranean trade connections established during this period created some of the most archaeologically visible evidence of Hallstatt prosperity. Greek and Etruscan artefacts found in alpine contexts indicate direct contact with southern European civilizations that valued salt for food preservation, religious ceremonies, and industrial processes. The Greek colonies along the Mediterranean coast required reliable salt supplies for their fishing industries and urban populations, while Etruscan cities used salt in metalworking processes and religious rituals. The famous Vix burial in Burgundy, dating to the late 6th century BC, demonstrates the ultimate expression of wealth accumulated through salt trade networks. The massive bronze crater found in this burial, manufactured in Greek workshops specifically for barbarian clients, represents the type of prestige object that salt wealth could command in international markets. The burial also contained locally manufactured items that show clear Hallstatt stylistic influences, indicating the cultural connections that accompanied economic relationships. Western trade routes extended Hallstatt influence toward Atlantic coastal regions through river systems like the Rhine and its tributaries. Archaeological evidence from sites in eastern France and western Germany shows increasing Hallstatt cultural influence during this period, with distinctive pottery styles and metalworking techniques appearing in local contexts. The movement of salt toward Atlantic regions facilitated access to tin deposits in Cornwall and Brittany, which remained essential for bronze production despite the increasing importance of iron technology. The emergence of a specialised merchant class represented one of the most significant social developments of the salt trade period. Unlike earlier exchange systems based on kinship obligations or warrior raiding, the salt trade required professional traders capable of managing complex multi-regional relationships and maintaining reliable supply chains. Archaeological evidence for this merchant class appears in the form of standardized weights and measures found at trading sites, along with distinctive burial assemblages that combine local and foreign artifacts in ways that suggest professional involvement in long-distance exchange. These merchants operated within social frameworks that granted them considerable autonomy while maintaining connections to traditional kinship and territorial authorities. Evidence suggests that successful traders accumulated sufficient wealth to establish independent households and sponsor their own craft production facilities. The workshops associated with merchant establishments produced goods specifically designed for trade purposes, including standardized pottery forms, bronze ornaments, and iron tools that met the preferences of different regional markets. The organizational requirements of large-scale salt production and trade necessitated new forms of economic specialization within Hallstatt communities. Mining operations required full-time workers with specialized skills in excavation, timber construction, and underground navigation. Surface processing facilities needed personnel capable of operating crushing equipment, managing inventory, and coordinating transportation logistics. The support services for these operations included food production, tool manufacturing, and maintenance activities that employed significant portions of local populations. Archaeological evidence from Hallstatt period settlements shows increasing economic differentiation between households engaged in different aspects of the salt trade economy. Elite residences display evidence of access to imported goods and locally manufactured luxury items, while households associated with mining and processing activities show more utilitarian material assemblages focused on tools and equipment necessary for their specialized functions. This differentiation reflects the development of economic hierarchies based on control over different aspects of the production and distribution process. The technological innovations required for efficient salt mining included advances in metallurgy, carpentry, and engineering that had applications beyond the immediate needs of extraction operations. The bronze tools manufactured for mining purposes incorporated design improvements that enhanced durability and effectiveness in underground conditions. Wooden construction techniques developed for mine support systems influenced building methods used in surface architecture and fortification construction. The engineering knowledge required for managing underground water flow and ventilation systems contributed to advances in hydraulic technology that appeared in other contexts. The scale of salt production at Hallstatt during this period can be estimated through archaeological evidence of mining activity and waste accumulation. The extent of ancient galleries and the volume of extracted material suggest annual production levels that far exceeded local consumption needs, confirming the export orientation of these operations. Comparative analysis with historical salt production data indicates that Hallstatt mines may have supplied salt to populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands across Central and Western Europe. The environmental impact of intensive salt mining included deforestation of surrounding areas to provide timber for mine construction and fuel for processing operations. Pollen analysis from the region shows significant reduction in forest cover during this period, with corresponding increases in grassland and agricultural areas. This environmental transformation required careful resource management to maintain sustainable timber supplies while meeting the enormous demands of mining operations. The social implications of salt wealth extended beyond economic differentiation to influence political structures and cultural practices. The concentration of wealth in communities controlling salt production created new forms of political authority based on economic control rather than traditional warrior leadership or kinship status. Archaeological evidence suggests that salt-wealthy elites sponsored religious activities and public works projects that enhanced their social prestige and political legitimacy. The religious significance of salt in Hallstatt culture appears in burial practices and ritual deposits that indicate beliefs about the spiritual properties of this essential commodity. Salt's preservative qualities may have influenced concepts about death and afterlife, while its economic importance certainly affected the social status of individuals involved in its production and trade. Ritual deposits of salt found at various sites suggest ceremonial uses that extended beyond its practical applications. The wealth generated through salt trade fundamentally transformed Hallstatt society during the 6th and 5th centuries BC, creating unprecedented levels of social stratification that manifested in every aspect of material culture. The egalitarian warrior societies of the early Hallstatt period gave way to complex hierarchical systems where economic control over salt production and trade networks determined social position more decisively than traditional markers of status. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a society increasingly divided between a small elite class that controlled vast resources and a larger population of specialised craftspeople, miners, traders, and agricultural workers whose social positions were defined by their relationships to the salt economy. The most dramatic evidence for this social transformation appears in the burial record, where the contrast between elite and common graves became stark and unmistakable. The princely graves, or Fürstengräber, that characterise this period represent a completely new phenomenon in Central European prehistory. These massive burial complexes required enormous investments of labour and resources, involving the construction of elaborate wooden chambers beneath large earthen mounds that could measure over 100 metres in diameter and reach heights of 15 metres or more. The Magdalenenberg burial near Villingen in southwestern Germany exemplifies these monuments, with its carefully engineered burial chamber constructed from massive oak timbers joined with sophisticated carpentry techniques, and surrounded by a complex arrangement of subsidiary graves that likely contained retainers, craftspeople, and other individuals whose social identities were tied to the deceased elite. The grave goods deposited in these princely burials demonstrate the global reach of Hallstatt trade networks and the extraordinary purchasing power that salt wealth provided. The Hochdorf burial, discovered near Stuttgart and dating to approximately 530 BC, contained a bronze couch decorated with intricate figurative scenes, imported silk textiles that originated in China, Etruscan bronze vessels including a massive cauldron capable of holding over 400 litres of liquid, and Greek pottery that had been manufactured specifically for barbarian markets. The deceased individual, a man in his 40s whose physical remains showed evidence of a lifetime of good nutrition and minimal manual labour, wore gold ornaments including a torque weighing nearly half a kilogram and gold-covered shoes that would have been completely impractical for everyday wear. The Mediterranean imports found in these burials reveal sophisticated knowledge of foreign luxury goods and established procurement networks that could deliver specific items to alpine buyers. Greek pottery from elite Hallstatt contexts often displays iconographic programs that suggest barbarian customers requested particular mythological scenes or decorative motifs. Etruscan bronze vessels show similar evidence of customization, with some pieces incorporating decorative elements that blend Mediterranean and Central European artistic traditions. The famous bronze crater from Vix, standing 1.64 metres tall and weighing over 200 kilograms, required specialised transportation arrangements and represented a diplomatic gift of extraordinary significance that acknowledged the recipient's importance in continental trade networks. The analysis of organic materials preserved in waterlogged burial contexts provides insights into the textile wealth that accompanied elite status. Silk fragments from several princely graves indicate access to luxury fabrics that had travelled the entire length of the Eurasian continent through early Silk Road networks. Locally produced textiles found in these same contexts show sophisticated weaving techniques using fine wool and linen threads, often incorporating complex patterns created through tablet weaving and other specialised methods. The presence of purple-dyed fabrics, created using expensive Mediterranean murex shells, demonstrates the global scope of elite consumption patterns and the enormous costs that salt wealth could support. The weapons and armour found in elite burials reflect both the martial traditions that continue to influence Hallstatt culture and the new technologies that salt wealth could command. Iron swords from this period show remarkable craftsmanship, with pattern-welded blades that combined different grades of iron and steel to create weapons that were both functional and visually striking. The decorative elements on these weapons often incorporated gold and silver inlays, amber studs, and intricate geometric patterns that required specialised metalworking techniques. Bronze helmets found in several princely graves display sophisticated understanding of protective design while incorporating decorative elements that proclaim the wearer's social status. The Strettweg Kultwagen, discovered in a princely burial in Austria, represents one of the most complex bronze-working achievements of the Hallstatt period. This wheeled bronze sculpture, standing nearly 40 centimetres tall, depicts a ritual scene involving human figures, animals, and ceremonial objects arranged around a central female figure holding a large bowl. The technical execution required mastery of lost wax casting techniques for multiple individual components that were then assembled into the final composition. The iconographic program suggests religious beliefs that connected elite status to supernatural powers and ritual responsibilities that justified social hierarchy through divine sanction. The settlement evidence from this period reveals equally dramatic social stratification in residential architecture and community organisation. The Heuneberg, located on the Upper Danube in southwestern Germany, represents the most extensively excavated example of an elite residential complex from this period. The fortified settlement covered approximately 3.2 hectares and was surrounded by a massive defensive wall constructed using Mediterranean building techniques that included mud brick construction on stone foundations. This architectural innovation, unprecedented in temperate Europe, required specialised knowledge that was probably acquired through direct contact with Greek or Etruscan builders. Within the Heuneberg fortifications, excavations have revealed a carefully planned residential district where elite households occupied large multi-room structures built using advanced construction techniques. These buildings featured stone foundations, timber-framed walls with clay and wattle infill, and sophisticated roofing systems that incorporated Mediterranean-style clay tiles. The larger structures contained specialised rooms for different functions, including workshops for luxury craft production, storage areas for valuable goods, and residential quarters that were heated using hypercore systems adapted from Mediterranean prototypes. The craft production areas within elite settlements demonstrate the economic foundations of aristocratic wealth and the specialised labour forces that supported luxury consumption. Workshops at the Heuneberg produced bronze vessels, jewellery and decorative objects using techniques that required years of training and access to expensive raw materials. The presence of amber working areas indicates direct connections to Baltic trade networks, while workshops containing coral fragments and Mediterranean shells demonstrate the global scope of craft production networks. Glassworking facilities produced beads and ornaments using techniques that were probably learned through contact with Etruscan or Greek craftspeople. The agricultural territories surrounding elite settlements show evidence of intensive land management and specialised production systems designed to support large non-productive populations. Pollen analysis from the Heuneberg region indicates extensive deforestation and the establishment of large-scale cereal cultivation areas that could support the concentrated populations within the fortified settlement. Archaeological survey has identified numerous subsidiary settlements and farmsteads that were probably occupied by agricultural specialists whose production supported the elite centre. The evidence for social mobility within Hallstatt society reveals both opportunities for advancement and the mechanisms through which traditional elites maintained their privileged positions. Wealthy merchant burials from this period show individuals who accumulated significant resources through trade activities, but whose grave goods differ subtly from those of traditional aristocratic families. These merchant graves often contain standardized weights and measures, exotic goods from multiple regions, and locally produced items that suggest involvement in craft production or trade facilitation. However, they typically lack the massive scale and Mediterranean imports that characterize the princely burials, suggesting that economic success alone was insufficient to achieve the highest social ranks. The warrior culture that had characterized earlier Hallstatt periods continued to influence social organization, but the nature of martial activity adapted to the new economic and political circumstances. Elite burials from this period contain weapons that emphasize display and ceremonial function over practical battlefield effectiveness. Swords with elaborate decorative hilts and scabbards show minimal evidence of actual use, while bronze armour pieces appear designed more for ritual or ceremonial contexts than for protection in combat. The shift towards ceremonial weaponry suggests that elite status was increasingly based on economic control rather than personal martial prowess. The archaeological evidence for warfare during this period indicates that conflicts increasingly focused on control over trade routes and resource extraction areas, rather than the cattle raiding and territorial disputes that had characterized earlier periods. Fortified sites controlling strategic river crossings and mountain passes show evidence of systematic destruction and rebuilding that suggests ongoing competition for commercial advantages. The defensive architecture at these sites incorporates sophisticated military engineering techniques, including overlapping fields of fire, protected gateways, and advanced siege-resistant construction methods. The religious practices associated with elite culture during this period reveal belief systems that legitimize social hierarchy through supernatural sanction. Ritual deposits at elite settlements often contain valuable objects that were deliberately destroyed or buried, suggesting ceremonies that demonstrated the wealth and piety of aristocratic sponsors. The Vic's burial included a massive bronze crater that contained evidence of honeymead, indicating funeral ceremonies that involved communal consumption of expensive alcoholic beverages. Similar evidence from other elite burials suggests that aristocratic funerals served as occasions for competitive display and community reinforcement of social hierarchies. The iconographic programs found on elite artifacts provide insights into the ideological frameworks that supported social stratification. Bronze vessels and decorative objects frequently depict scenes of hunting, feasting, and ritual activities that emphasize the leisure and ceremonial responsibilities of aristocratic life. Human figures in these scenes are often shown in hierarchical arrangements that clearly distinguish between elite and subordinate individuals through differences in size, clothing, and positioning. Animal imagery emphasizes creatures associated with elite activities, particularly hunting scenes featuring deer, wild boar, and waterfowl that required specialized equipment and leisure time to pursue. The evidence for craft specialization during this period reveals increasingly sophisticated production systems that supported elite consumption while creating opportunities for social advancement through technical expertise. Master craftspeople appear to have occupied intermediate social positions between the aristocratic elite and common labourers, with workshop areas that suggest independent economic activity and burial assemblages that include both locally produced and imported goods. The technical knowledge required for advanced metalworking, textile production, and other luxury crafts created specialised social niches that provided pathways to economic prosperity and enhanced social status. The regional variations in elite culture during this period reflect the diverse economic foundations of Hallstatt prosperity and the different strategies through which local aristocracies maintained their positions. Communities controlling salt production developed distinctive cultural expressions that emphasized their unique economic advantages, while settlements along major trade routes created elite cultures that reflected their roles as intermediaries in long-distance exchange networks. These regional differences contributed to the cultural diversity that characterized the later Hallstatt period, while maintaining underlying similarities in social organization and material culture that defined the broader Hallstatt phenomenon. The complex social hierarchies that emerged during the mature Hallstatt period were inextricably linked to equally sophisticated religious systems that permeated every aspect of daily life, from the most mundane agricultural activities to the elaborate ceremonies that accompanied elite burials. Archaeological evidence reveals that Hallstatt communities developed distinctive ritual practices that reflected their unique position as intermediaries between diverse cultural traditions while maintaining indigenous belief systems rooted in centuries of local development. The religious landscape of this period encompassed a wide range of sacred activities, from intimate household rituals to massive public ceremonies that reinforce social bonds and legitimize political authority. The practice of depositing valuable objects in bodies of water represents one of the most archaeologically visible aspects of Hallstatt religious life, with evidence spanning the entire cultural area from the Alpine heartland to the furthest reaches of trade networks. These aquatic deposits, found in lakes, rivers, springs and marshes, demonstrate consistent patterns of ritual behaviour that suggest shared beliefs about the sacred nature of water and its role as a medium for communication with supernatural forces. The famous deposits at Latene, discovered in Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, contained over 2,500 iron objects, including weapons, tools and personal ornaments that had been deliberately placed in the water over several centuries. The careful positioning of these objects, often arranged in specific patterns or concentrations, indicates that their deposition followed established ceremonial protocols rather than representing casual disposal or accidental loss. The Duchkopf hoard, discovered in a spring in Bohemia, provides exceptional insights into the scale and significance of aquatic ritual deposits. This massive assemblage contained over 2,000 bronze objects, including cauldrons, buckets, jewellery and weapons, with a combined weight exceeding 1 ton of metal. The presence of objects from across Central Europe, including items manufactured in distant regions and exotic materials like amber and coral, demonstrates that these ritual deposits drew upon extensive networks of exchange and represented enormous investments of community resources. The deliberate damage visible on many objects, including intentionally bent swords and punctured vessels, suggests that destruction was an integral part of the ritual process, perhaps symbolically killing the objects to transfer their essence to the supernatural realm. The seasonal timing of these aquatic deposits appears to have followed agricultural and astronomical cycles that connected ritual activities to the natural rhythms that governed Hallstatt life. Analysis of organic materials preserved in waterlogged contexts indicates that many deposits occurred during specific times of year, particularly during spring and autumn transitions, when agricultural communities faced critical decisions about planting and harvesting. The presence of food offerings, including preserved grains, fruits and animal remains, suggests that these ceremonies involved communal feasting and the sharing of agricultural surplus with supernatural powers who controlled weather, fertility and agricultural success. The geographic distribution of aquatic deposits reveals patterns that correspond to territorial boundaries and resource control areas, suggesting that ritual activities served important functions in defining and legitimizing claims to specific landscapes. Major deposits often occur at strategic locations such as river confluences, lake outlets, and spring sources that would have served as natural gathering places for communities scattered across large territories. The Linfor hoard in Wales, though geographically distant from the Hallstatt core area, demonstrates the widespread adoption of aquatic ritual practices and contains a mixture of local and continental European objects that illustrates the cultural connections maintained through trade networks. The analysis of weapon deposits provides particularly detailed insights into the martial aspects of Hallstatt religious beliefs and the ceremonies that surrounded warfare and conflict resolution. Swords found in aquatic contexts often show evidence of ritual bending or breaking that would have rendered them useless for combat, suggesting beliefs about the spiritual power of weapons and the need to neutralize their potential for violence through ceremonial destruction. The presence of complete weapon sets, including swords, spears, and shields deposited together, may represent the equipment of individual warriors whose deaths in battle or other circumstances required ritual commemoration through aquatic burial. The technological sophistication of objects chosen for aquatic deposition demonstrates the high value placed on these ritual activities and the willingness of communities to sacrifice valuable resources for religious purposes. Bronze cauldrons, capable of holding hundreds of litres of liquid, represent enormous investments in raw materials and skilled labour, yet they appear regularly in water deposits across the Hallstatt world. The famous Gundestrup cauldron, though dating to a later period, exemplifies the type of ceremonial vessel that played central roles in Hallstatt ritual life, with its elaborate iconographic program depicting mythological scenes and religious ceremonies that provide glimpses into the belief systems that motivated these practices. The burial customs practiced during the Hallstatt period reveal equally complex religious beliefs about death, afterlife, and the maintenance of social relationships beyond the grave. The regional variations in burial practices reflect both local traditions and the influence of cultural exchanges facilitated by trade networks, creating a diverse landscape of mortuary customs that nonetheless shared underlying concepts about proper treatment of the dead. The transition from cremation to inhumation that occurred in many regions during this period represents more than a simple change in burial technique. It reflects fundamental shifts in beliefs about the nature of death and the requirements for successful transition to the afterlife. In the eastern Hallstatt regions, cremation remained the predominant burial practice throughout most of the period, continuing traditions established during the Urnfield culture centuries earlier. However, the treatment of cremated remains and the associated grave goods underwent significant elaboration that reflected the social stratification and wealth accumulation of the salt trade period. Elite cremation burials often involved the construction of the elaborate pyre sites, where the deceased and their possessions were burned together in ceremonies that could last for days and involve entire communities. The famous Magdalenenberg burial complex in southwestern Germany included evidence of massive pyre construction that required specialized engineering to achieve the high temperatures necessary for complete cremation of large quantities of organic materials. The ashes and bone fragments recovered from cremation sites were carefully collected and processed according to specific protocols that varied by region and social status. Elite burials often involved the separation of different types of remains, with human bones placed in bronze or ceramic urns, while the ashes of burned grave goods were deposited in separate containers or scattered in prescribed patterns around the burial site. The presence of unburned objects placed alongside cremated remains suggests complex beliefs about which possessions should accompany the deceased into the afterlife and which should remain in the world of the living. The Western Hallstatt regions witnessed a gradual transition toward inhumation practices that may have been influenced by contact with Mediterranean cultures where body burial was the standard practice. However, the adoption of inhumation in Hallstatt contexts involved distinctive local innovations that created burial practices unlike those found elsewhere in Europe. The wooden burial chambers constructed for elite inhumations represented sophisticated engineering projects that required advanced carpentry skills and careful attention to preservation techniques designed to maintain the integrity of the deceased and their grave goods for extended periods. The orientation and positioning of inhumation burials reveal systematic patterns that suggest specific beliefs about directional symbolism and proper bodily arrangement for the afterlife journey. Many Hallstatt inhumations were oriented along east-west axes, with the deceased positioned to face either the rising or setting sun, depending on regional traditions and individual circumstances. The careful positioning of grave goods around the body followed established protocols that placed weapons near the right hand, drinking vessels near the head, and personal ornaments in their appropriate locations on the body, creating arrangements that preserve the social identity and status of the deceased in death. The grave goods deposited with both cremation and inhumation burials provide detailed insights into Hallstatt beliefs about the material requirements for afterlife existence and the social relationships that continued beyond death. The presence of complete sets of everyday objects, including tools, weapons, jewellery, and household items, suggests beliefs that the deceased would continue to need these possessions in their post-mortem existence. However, the selection and treatment of grave goods also followed symbolic logic that emphasized particular aspects of social identity and spiritual preparation, rather than simply replicating the material conditions of life. The inclusion of food and drink in burial context demonstrates beliefs about the physical needs of the deceased and the importance of maintaining proper relationships between the living and the dead through ongoing provisioning. Large bronze cauldrons and drinking vessels found in elite burials often contain residues of alcoholic beverages, particularly honey mead and imported wine, that indicate elaborate funeral feasts where the community shared food and drink with the deceased. The presence of imported amphorae and specialized drinking equipment suggests that these funeral ceremonies involve the consumption of exotic beverages that emphasize the international connections and sophisticated tastes of the deceased elite. The treatment of animals in burial contexts reveals complex beliefs about the relationships between humans and other species, and the role of animals in facilitating transitions between different realms of existence. Horse burials found in association with elite human graves involve the careful positioning of complete animals, along with their riding and driving equipment, suggesting beliefs about the continued need for transportation in the afterlife. The presence of dog burials, often positioned near the feet of human burials, may reflect beliefs about the protective and guiding functions of these animals in the journey to the afterlife. The construction of burial monuments and the organisation of cemetery landscapes demonstrate the importance of maintaining visible connections between the living community and their deceased ancestors. The massive earthen mounds that covered elite burials served as permanent landmarks that proclaimed the continued presence and influence of powerful individuals long after their deaths. These monuments required enormous investments of community labour and represented ongoing commitments to maintaining the memory and status of the deceased through landscape modification that could be seen from great distances. The sacred sites and temple structures associated with Hallstatt communities reveal the physical settings where religious activities took place, and the architectural forms that supported various types of ceremonial behaviour. Hilltop sanctuaries positioned on prominent elevations that commanded extensive views over surrounding territories served as focal points for religious activities that brought together communities scattered across large areas. The Magdalensburg Sanctuary in Carinthia exemplifies these elevated religious sites, with evidence of temple structures, ritual deposits, and ceremonial activities that spanned several centuries of Hallstatt occupation. The temple architecture found at these hilltop sites demonstrates sophisticated understanding of sacred space organisation and the physical requirements for different types of religious ceremonies. Rectangular wooden structures with internal divisions created spaces for different ritual activities, while external areas provided gathering spaces for larger community ceremonies. The careful orientation of these buildings according to astronomical alignment suggests knowledge of celestial cycles and their integration into religious practice, with doorways and windows positioned to capture specific solar and lunar phenomena that marked important ceremonial occasions. The ritual deposits found at sanctuary sites reveal the types of offerings considered appropriate for different supernatural powers and the seasonal cycles that governed religious activities. Weapons deposits at hilltop sanctuaries often occur in contexts suggesting victory celebrations, or pre-battle ceremonies where warriors sought supernatural assistance for military endeavours. Agricultural tools and livestock remains indicate ceremonies related to farming activities and the seasonal cycles that governed agricultural production. The presence of imported objects and exotic materials demonstrates that sanctuary rituals involve the same types of valuable offerings found in burial contexts and aquatic deposits. The symbolic iconography found on Hallstatt metalwork, pottery, and personal ornaments provides direct insights into the cosmological beliefs and mythological systems that underpinned religious practices. The geometric patterns that dominate Hallstatt decorative arts reflect sophisticated understanding of mathematical relationships and their symbolic significance in representing cosmic order and divine harmony. Solar symbols, including wheel motifs and radial patterns, appear consistently across different types of objects and suggest central roles for sun worship and solar symbolism in Hallstatt religious thought. The animal imagery found on Hallstatt artifacts reveals beliefs about the spiritual significance of different species and their roles as intermediaries between human and supernatural realms. Waterfowl, particularly swans and ducks, appear frequently in decorative programs and may represent souls in transition or divine messengers capable of moving between terrestrial and celestial realms. Deer and other forest animals symbolize the wild spaces beyond human control and the spiritual powers that governed hunting success and forest resources. Horses, consistently associated with elite burials and high-status objects, represent not only practical transportation but also spiritual journey and the connection between earthly and divine authority. The anthropomorphic figures depicted on Hallstatt artifacts provide rare glimpses into beliefs about divine beings and their relationships with human communities. Female figures holding various objects, including bowls, wheels, and plant motifs, may represent goddess figures associated with fertility, abundance, and agricultural success. Male figures shown in warrior poses or holding weapons suggest divine protectors or ancestral spirits who continue to influence the martial fortunes of their descendants. The hierarchical arrangements of human figures in many decorative scenes reflect the social stratification of Hallstatt society, while suggesting that supernatural realms were organised according to similar principles of rank and authority. The religious and ceremonial objects that dominated Hallstatt artistic expression required unprecedented levels of technological sophistication, driving innovations in metallurgy, pottery production, textile manufacturing and woodworking that transformed the material capabilities of Central European societies. The ironworking techniques that had emerged during the early Hallstatt period reached full maturity by 600 BC, with smiths developing specialised knowledge of ore selection, smelting processes, and alloy composition that produced tools and weapons of exceptional quality. Archaeological analysis of iron artefacts from this period reveals systematic understanding of carbon content manipulation, with smiths deliberately creating steel-like properties in cutting edges, while maintaining malleable cores that could absorb shock without fracturing. The smelting furnaces found at major Hallstatt production centres demonstrate significant advances in pyrotechnology and metallurgical engineering. The furnaces at Magdalensberg and Carinthia, dating to the mature Hallstatt period, incorporated sophisticated air circulation systems using bellows arrangements that could maintain temperatures exceeding 1400 degrees Celsius for extended periods. These installations featured carefully constructed clay linings reinforced with crushed pottery and organic materials that created refractory surfaces capable of withstanding repeated heating cycles without deterioration. The slag deposits associated with these furnaces show evidence of flux additions, including limestone and sand, that facilitated the separation of metallic iron from ore impurities and improved the quality of the final product. The iron ore utilised in Hallstatt smelting operations came from carefully selected deposits that contained optimal mineral compositions for producing high-quality metal. The ores from the Erzberg region of Austria contained naturally occurring manganese and silicon compounds that enhanced the working properties of smelted iron without requiring additional alloying elements. Smiths developed systematic knowledge of different ore types and their appropriate applications, with bog iron used for everyday tools and implements, while higher-grade ores were reserved for weapons and prestige objects that required superior performance characteristics. The forging techniques employed by Hallstatt smiths incorporated sophisticated understanding of heat treatment and mechanical working that produced tools with properties tailored to specific applications. Archaeological examination of iron knives reveals evidence of differential hardening, where cutting edges were selectively heat-treated to achieve maximum hardness, while tang areas remained soft and workable for hafting. Sword blades show evidence of pattern welding, a complex technique where strips of iron with different carbon contents were twisted together and forged into composite structures that combine the best properties of each component material. The production of iron tools required specialised knowledge of hafting techniques and the integration of metal components with organic materials. Preserved wooden handles from the Hallstatt salt mines demonstrate sophisticated understanding of wood grain orientation and species selection for different tool applications. Ashwood was preferred for hammer and axe handles due to its shock-absorbing properties, while beech and oak were selected for cutting tools that required rigid support for sharp edges. The attachment methods included complex joinery techniques, metal ferrules, and organic binding materials that created durable connections capable of withstanding intensive use in mining and agricultural applications. The alloy compositions achieved by Hallstatt smiths reveal experimental approaches to metallurgy that produce specialised materials for different purposes. Bronze continued to play important roles in decorative applications and specialised tools, with smiths developing tin-bronze alloys containing precise proportions of copper, tin, and trace elements that enhance casting properties and visual appearance. Lead-bronze alloys were employed for objects requiring dense, easily worked material, while brass alloys incorporating zinc created distinctive golden colours that were prized for jewellery and decorative elements. The casting techniques used for bronze production achieved remarkable sophistication in both technical execution and artistic expression. The lost wax casting process employed for complex objects like the Strettweg Kultwagen required master craftsmen capable of creating intricate wax models, constructing multi-part clay moulds, and managing the precise temperature control necessary for successful casting of large, complex forms. Evidence from bronze working sites shows the use of ceramic crucibles lined with specialised clay mixtures that could withstand repeated heating cycles while maintaining chemical neutrality that prevented contamination of molten metal. The development of specialised metallurgical tools reflects the growing complexity of metalworking operations and the need for precision instruments capable of supporting advanced techniques. Bronze tongs with carefully shaped jaws allowed smiths to manipulate hot metal with accuracy, while specialised hammers with different head shapes and weights provided the control necessary for detailed forming operations. Anvils carved from single blocks of iron provided stable working surfaces that could absorb the impact forces generated during forging without transmitting vibrations that would compromise precision work. The pottery production systems that supported Hallstatt communities achieved remarkable standardization and technical sophistication, while maintaining regional stylistic variations that reflected local preferences and cultural identities. The ceramic workshops identified at major settlements employed specialized kilns capable of achieving controlled firing atmospheres that produced consistent results across large production runs. The kilns at the Huneberg demonstrate advanced understanding of combustion dynamics, with carefully designed fireboxes, flue systems, and chamber configurations that maintained uniform temperatures throughout the firing process. The clay preparation techniques employed by Hallstatt potters involved systematic processing of raw materials to achieve optimal working properties and firing characteristics. Archaeological analysis reveals the use of carefully selected clay sources that were processed through settling, mixing, and tempering procedures that removed impurities and enhanced plasticity. Temper materials included crushed pottery, sand, and organic additives that controlled shrinkage during drying and firing while providing structural strength in the finished vessels. The forming techniques used for pottery production included both wheel throwing and hand building methods that were selected according to vessel size, shape requirements, and intended functions. Large storage vessels were typically constructed using coil building techniques that allowed potters to achieve massive sizes while maintaining wall thickness control and structural integrity. Smaller vessels, particularly drinking cups and serving bowls, were often wheel thrown to achieve the precise proportions and smooth surfaces required for elite table service. The decorative techniques applied to Hallstatt pottery demonstrate sophisticated understanding of surface treatment and firing effects that created distinctive visual characteristics. Burnishing techniques using smooth stone tools created lustrous surfaces that enhanced the natural colours of fired clay, while providing water-resistant finishes for storage and serving vessels. Slip applications using refined clay suspensions created uniform surface colours and provided bases for painted decorations that incorporated geometric patterns and stylized motifs reflecting regional artistic traditions. The regional variations in pottery styles reflect both functional adaptations to local needs and cultural preferences that maintained community identities within the broader Hallstatt cultural framework. Eastern Hallstatt pottery traditions emphasised geometric decoration and burnished surfaces that created distinctive visual effects through contrasts between matte and glossy areas. Western regions developed painted decoration techniques using mineral pigments that created polychrome effects and incorporated motifs derived from Mediterranean artistic influences encountered through trade relationships. The functional specialisation evident in Hallstatt pottery assemblages reveals sophisticated understanding of vessel requirements for different activities and the technical challenges involved in creating containers optimised for specific purposes. Cooking pots incorporated heat-resistant temper materials and wall thickness variations that provided thermal shock resistance while maintaining structural strength under repeated heating cycles. Storage vessels featured carefully designed rim configurations and surface treatments that facilitated sealing and prevented contamination of stored contents. The textile production capabilities of Hallstatt communities achieved remarkable sophistication, as evidenced by the preserved organic materials recovered from the anaerobic conditions of salt mine contexts and waterlogged archaeological sites. The textile fragments from Hallstatt demonstrate mastery of multiple fibre preparation techniques, including the processing of wool, linen, and imported materials that required specialised knowledge of cleaning, combing, and spinning procedures. Wool preparation involved systematic sorting of fleeces according to fibre quality, followed by cleaning processes that removed lanolin and debris while preserving the natural properties that enhance spinning and weaving operations. The spinning techniques employed by Hallstatt textile workers achieved thread qualities that supported the production of fine fabrics suitable for elite consumption and trade purposes. Spindle whorls found at archaeological sites show systematic size and weight variations that correspond to different thread requirements, with heavy whorls used for coarse threads and light, precisely balanced whorls employed for fine work. The thread qualities achieved through these spinning techniques enabled the production of textiles with thread counts approaching those of modern commercial fabrics. The weaving technologies utilised in Hallstatt textile production included both simple and complex loom systems that supported the creation of fabrics ranging from utilitarian cloth to elaborate decorative textiles. Warp-weighted looms, evidenced by the distribution of loom weights in excavated structures, provided the primary technology for producing large pieces of cloth suitable for clothing and household use. Tablet weaving techniques, demonstrated by the presence of bone and antler tablets at various sites, enabled the production of narrow bands and decorative trim pieces that incorporated complex patternwork and colour variations. The dyeing techniques employed by Hallstatt textile workers achieved vibrant colours using both local and imported colorants that created distinctive visual effects and demonstrated access to specialised knowledge and materials. Local plant materials, including madder root for red colours and woad for blue tones, provided the foundation for most dyeing operations. However, the presence of purple-dyed textiles in elite burial contexts indicates access to expensive Mediterranean murex dyes that required extensive trade relationships and enormous financial resources to obtain. The textile tools recovered from Hallstatt contexts reveal the specialised equipment required for different stages of fibre processing and fabric production. Combs carved from bone and antler show wear patterns indicating intensive use in wool preparation, while needles of various sizes demonstrate the range of sewing and embroidery techniques employed in textile finishing. The presence of textile shears and cutting tools indicates systematic approaches to fabric cutting and garment construction that required precision and planning to minimise waste of valuable materials. The woodworking capabilities demonstrated by preserved organic materials from Hallstatt sites reveal sophisticated understanding of timber selection, seasoning, and construction techniques that supported both utilitarian and artistic applications. The wooden infrastructure preserved in the salt mines provides extraordinary evidence of carpentry skills, including complex joinery techniques that created strong, durable connections without metal fasteners. Mortise and tenon joints, dovetail connections, and lap joints demonstrate systematic knowledge of wood properties and mechanical principles that enable the construction of load-bearing structures in challenging underground environments. The timber selection practices employed by Hallstatt carpenters reveal detailed knowledge of different wood species and their appropriate applications for specific construction requirements. Oak timber was preferred for structural applications requiring maximum strength and durability, while softer woods like pine and fir were selected for applications where workability and weight considerations were more important than ultimate strength. The preserved wooden artifacts show evidence of systematic seasoning processes that reduced moisture content and improved dimensional stability in finished products. The construction techniques used for wooden vehicles demonstrate advanced understanding of mechanical principles and the engineering requirements for creating functional transportation equipment. The wooden wheels preserved in waterlogged contexts show sophisticated spoke and hub construction that distributed loads effectively while minimizing weight. The joinery techniques used in wheel construction incorporated wedges, pins, and carefully fitted components that created assemblies capable of withstanding the stresses imposed by loaded vehicles travelling over rough terrain. The household objects carved from wood reveal the artistic capabilities of Hallstatt woodworkers and their ability to combine functional requirements with decorative elements that enhance the visual appeal of everyday items. Bowls, cups, and serving vessels show evidence of turning techniques that created smooth, symmetrical forms with consistent wall thickness. The decorative carving found on these objects incorporates geometric patterns and stylized motifs that complement the artistic traditions expressed in metalwork and pottery. The preservation of wooden architectural elements in anaerobic contexts provides insights into the construction techniques used for buildings and fortifications that have otherwise disappeared from the archaeological record. Post and beam construction techniques created frameworks that could support substantial loads while allowing for modification and expansion as community needs changed. The timber connections used in these structures incorporated sophisticated joinery that created rigid assemblies without requiring metal fasteners that would have been expensive and potentially subject to corrosion in exposed conditions. The technological mastery achieved by Hallstatt craftsmen provided the foundation for dramatic transformations in settlement organisation and architectural expression that reflected the complex social hierarchies and economic specialisation of the mature period. The small, dispersed agricultural villages that had characterised the early Hallstatt landscape gave way to increasingly sophisticated settlement systems organised around fortified hilltop centres that controlled surrounding territories and coordinated specialised economic activities. These fortified settlements, known as oppidæ in later Celtic contexts, represented revolutionary developments in European urbanism that would influence settlement patterns for centuries to come. The evolution of Hallstatt settlement patterns occurred gradually over several centuries, driven by the accumulating wealth from salt trade and the need to protect valuable resources and populations from competing groups. The earliest fortified sites, dating to around 700 BC, consisted of relatively simple earthwork defences surrounding existing village communities. However, by 600 BC these had developed into massive fortification complexes that required coordinated labour forces numbering in the thousands and engineering capabilities that rivaled contemporary Mediterranean urban centres. The Heuneberg, positioned strategically on a plateau overlooking the upper Danube River, exemplifies the mature Hallstatt fortified settlement in both its defensive capabilities and internal organisation. The site's natural advantages included steep slopes on three sides that provided inherent defensive value, while the fourth side faced a narrow neck of land that could be easily fortified and controlled. The builders enhanced these natural features through massive earthwork construction that created defensive walls rising over 6 metres above the surrounding terrain, with internal structures that provided platforms for defenders and storage areas for weapons and supplies. The most remarkable aspect of the Heuneberg fortifications was the incorporation of Mediterranean building techniques that had never before appeared in temperate European contexts. The defensive wall included sections constructed using mud brick techniques on stone foundations, a technology that required specialised knowledge of clay preparation, brick formation and wall construction methods. Archaeological evidence suggests that this knowledge was acquired through direct contact with Greek or Etruscan builders, possibly craftsmen who travelled north specifically to work on this project, or Hallstatt individuals who had observed these techniques during travels to Mediterranean regions. The internal organisation of the Heuneberg reveals sophisticated urban planning that allocated space according to social hierarchies and functional requirements. The highest elevation within the fortified area contained the largest residential structures, built using advanced timber framing techniques with stone foundations and featuring multiple rooms organised around central courtyards. These elite residences incorporated heating systems adapted from Mediterranean hypocaust designs, with underground channels that distributed warm air throughout the buildings during cold seasons. The presence of Mediterranean-style roof tiles, manufactured locally using imported technical knowledge, demonstrates the extent to which foreign architectural concepts were adapted to local conditions and preferences. The craft production areas within the Heuneberg were systematically organised according to the specific requirements of different manufacturing activities. Metalworking zones were positioned near the fortification walls, where prevailing winds could carry smoke and fumes away from residential areas, while pottery production areas were located near water sources and clay deposits that facilitated the ceramic manufacturing process. The workshops themselves featured specialised architectural elements, including furnace installations, storage areas for raw materials, and work surfaces designed for specific craft activities. Archaeological excavation of the metalworking areas has revealed evidence of bronze and iron production facilities that operated on industrial scales previously unknown in Central Europe. The bronzeworking installations included multiple furnaces capable of melting large quantities of metal simultaneously, along with specialised areas for mould preparation and casting operations. The ironworking facilities incorporated bellows systems and forge installations that could maintain the high temperatures necessary for steel production, with evidence of systematic approaches to raw material processing and finished product quality control. The residential architecture within fortified settlements demonstrates clear social stratification through variations in building size, construction quality, and architectural elaboration. Elite households occupied structures measuring up to 30 metres in length and featuring complex internal divisions that created specialised spaces for different activities. These buildings incorporated advanced construction techniques, including timber framing with mortise and tenon joinery, wattle and daub wall infill, and sophisticated roofing systems that provided weather protection while allowing for smoke ventilation from internal hearths. The houses of craft specialists and other non-elite residents were smaller but nonetheless well constructed, typically measuring 10 to 15 metres in length and featuring simpler internal arrangements with fewer specialised rooms. However, these structures still incorporated advanced building techniques and demonstrated access to quality construction materials, suggesting that the prosperity generated by salt trade and craft production benefited broad segments of the population, rather than being restricted to a small aristocratic class. The agricultural territories surrounding fortified settlements show evidence of intensive land management and systematic approaches to resource exploitation that supported the concentrated populations within defended centres. Pollen analysis from the Heuneberg region indicates extensive deforestation during the mature Hallstatt period, with forest clearance creating large areas of agricultural land that could support cereal cultivation on scales necessary to feed non-productive urban populations. The cleared areas were systematically managed through controlled burning and selective replanting that maintained timber resources for construction and fuel while maximising agricultural productivity. Archaeological survey around major Hallstatt centres has identified numerous subsidiary settlements and specialised sites that formed integrated economic systems centred on the fortified oppida. These subsidiary sites included agricultural villages that focused on food production, mining settlements that extracted raw materials, and specialised craft production centres that manufactured goods for trade and local consumption. The spatial organisation of these settlement systems reveals sophisticated understanding of transportation logistics and resource distribution networks that connected scattered communities into coherent economic units. The defensive architecture of Hallstatt fortifications incorporated engineering principles and construction techniques that represented significant advances over earlier European fortification systems. The walls typically featured complex profiles with multiple defensive lines, including outer earthworks that channeled attackers into predetermined approach routes, main defensive walls with integrated towers and fighting platforms, and inner citadel areas that provided final refuge positions. The gateways incorporated sophisticated defensive features including overlapping approach routes, multiple barrier systems, and architectural elements that provided defenders with tactical advantages over attackers. The construction of these massive fortifications required organisational capabilities and labour coordination that had no precedent in Central European societies. Estimates based on the volume of earthwork and stone construction at sites like the Heuneberg suggest that construction projects involved thousands of workers operating over multiple construction seasons. The logistics of providing food, tools, and materials for these workers, along with the technical supervision required for complex engineering projects, indicates the emergence of administrative capabilities and social organisation systems that approach those of contemporary Mediterranean city-states. The architectural evidence for craft production within settlements reveals the specialised infrastructure required for different manufacturing activities and the integration of production facilities into overall settlement planning. Pottery workshops required kilns with specific thermal properties, along with storage areas for clay, temper materials, and finished products. The kiln designs found at Hallstatt sites incorporated sophisticated understanding of combustion dynamics and temperature control, with multi-chamber systems that allowed for different firing atmospheres and precise control over ceramic properties. Textile production facilities within settlements included specialised buildings for fibre processing, spinning and weaving activities. These structures featured architectural elements designed to support the equipment required for different stages of textile production, including areas for loom installations, fibre storage, and dyeing operations. The presence of dedicated textile workshops within fortified settlements indicates that cloth production had become a specialised economic activity, rather than simply a household craft, with implications for trade relationships and social organisation. The evidence for agricultural practices associated with Hallstatt settlements reveals sophisticated understanding of land management and crop production techniques that supported both local consumption and trade activities. Paleobotanical analysis from settlement contexts indicates systematic cultivation of multiple cereal species, including wheat, barley, and millet, along with legume crops that provided protein sources and soil improvement through nitrogen fixation. The crop rotation systems evidenced by pollen and seed analysis demonstrate knowledge of agricultural techniques that maintained soil fertility while maximising yields from available land. The animal husbandry practices associated with Hallstatt settlements involved systematic management of livestock populations that provided meat, dairy products, and raw materials for craft production. Cattle remained the primary livestock species, with bone analysis indicating selective breeding practices that enhance size and meat production capabilities. The presence of specialised structures for livestock housing and feed storage within settlement areas suggests that animal husbandry had become an intensive activity that required systematic management and significant resource investment. The storage facilities found within Hallstatt settlements demonstrate the scale of surplus production and the organisational requirements for managing agricultural and craft products. Large granaries with capacities measured in tons of stored grain indicate production levels that far exceeded immediate consumption needs, suggesting systematic approaches to surplus management and trade preparation. The storage structures incorporated sophisticated design features, including raised floors that prevented moisture damage, ventilation systems that maintained air circulation, and access controls that protected valuable contents from theft or unauthorized use. The water management systems developed for Hallstatt settlements reveal advanced understanding of hydraulic engineering and the infrastructure requirements for supporting concentrated populations. Wells, cisterns and drainage systems provided reliable water supplies while managing waste disposal and preventing contamination of living areas. The engineering sophistication of these systems, including stone-lined wells and ceramic pipe networks, demonstrates technical capabilities that supported urban-scale populations in locations that lacked natural water sources. The transportation infrastructure associated with Hallstatt settlements included road systems, bridges and harbour facilities that connected fortified centres to their surrounding territories and distant trade networks. Archaeological evidence of paved roads and engineered river crossings indicates systematic approaches to transportation planning that facilitated the movement of people, goods and information across the landscape. The harbour installations found at lakeside settlements incorporated sophisticated understanding of water level management and cargo handling requirements. The environmental impact of intensive Hallstatt settlement and resource exploitation created landscape transformations that remained visible for centuries after the culture's decline. Deforestation around major centres permanently altered local ecosystems, while mining activities created landscape features that continued to influence land use patterns. The agricultural intensification associated with Hallstatt settlements established field systems and land boundaries that influenced subsequent settlement patterns and agricultural practices. The regional variations in Hallstatt settlement patterns reflect adaptations to local environmental conditions and resource availability, while maintaining underlying organisational principles that characterise the broader cultural phenomenon. Alpine settlements focused on controlling mineral resources and mountain passes, while lowland sites emphasised agricultural production and river transportation networks. These regional adaptations created diverse settlement landscapes that nonetheless shared architectural traditions and organisational principles that defined Hallstatt urban development. The influence of Hallstatt settlement patterns on subsequent European development extended far beyond the immediate cultural area, with fortified hilltop centres serving as prototypes for later Celtic oppidar and Roman urban foundations. The architectural techniques and urban planning concepts developed during the Hallstatt period provided foundations for European urbanism that continued to influence settlement development throughout the Iron Age and into the Roman period. The sophisticated settlement patterns and architectural achievements of the mature Hallstatt period provided the physical framework for an equally remarkable flowering of artistic expression that reflected the complex cultural synthesis occurring across Central Europe. The workshops and craft production centres housed within fortified settlements became laboratories of innovation, where traditional indigenous artistic traditions merged with influences from distant civilizations, creating distinctive visual languages that communicated social hierarchies, religious beliefs, and cultural identities through increasingly sophisticated, symbolic programs. The geometric patterns that dominated early Hallstatt decorative arts evolved into complex compositional systems that incorporated mathematical relationships and proportional harmonies, reflecting sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. These patterns, found across multiple media from pottery to metalwork to textiles, employed recurring motifs including concentric circles, interlocking spirals, and angular meander designs that created visual rhythms and structural frameworks for more elaborate iconographic programs. The geometric vocabulary developed during this period demonstrated systematic understanding of symmetry principles, with artists employing rotational and reflectional symmetry to create balanced compositions that maintained visual coherence across objects of varying scales and functions. Archaeological analysis of decorated objects reveals that geometric patterns served multiple functions beyond pure aesthetic appeal, operating as symbolic systems that conveyed cultural meanings and social information to viewers familiar with their iconographic conventions. The concentric circle motifs that appear consistently on bronze vessels, belt plates, and personal ornaments may have represented solar symbolism or concepts of cosmic order, while spiral patterns could signify cyclical time, seasonal changes, or spiritual transformation. The mathematical precision evident in these patterns suggests that their creation required specialized knowledge and training, indicating the emergence of professional artists whose technical skills and cultural literacy elevated them above ordinary craft workers. The animal motifs that increasingly dominated Hallstatt artistic expression during the mature period reflected both the natural environment of Central Europe and the expanded cultural horizons created by long-distance trade relationships. Local fauna including deer, wild boar, waterfowl and horses appeared in stylized representations that emphasized particular characteristics or behaviors relevant to their symbolic meanings. Deer, frequently depicted with elaborate antler configurations, may have represented regeneration and seasonal renewal, while wild boar imagery emphasized martial prowess and dangerous power. The artistic treatment of these animals often involved geometric stylization that abstracted natural forms into symbolic essences, while maintaining recognizable species characteristics. The integration of exotic animal motifs into Hallstatt artistic vocabulary demonstrates the cultural impact of trade relationships with distant civilizations. Lions, griffins, and other fantastic creatures derived from Near Eastern artistic traditions appeared on high-status objects, often combined with local motifs in hybrid compositions that reflected the cosmopolitan outlook of Hallstatt elites. These exotic elements were not simply copied from foreign prototypes, but underwent systematic transformation that adapted them to local aesthetic preferences and symbolic requirements. The result was a distinctive artistic synthesis that maintained cultural authenticity while incorporating international influences. The anthropomorphic representations found in Hallstatt art provide direct insights into contemporary beliefs about human identity, social relationships, and supernatural powers. Human figures appearing on bronze vessels and decorative objects typically display hierarchical arrangements that reflect social stratification, with size differences, costume variations, and positional relationships clearly distinguishing between elite and subordinate individuals. The artistic conventions used to represent human forms employed standardized iconographic elements, including distinctive hairstyles, clothing patterns, and gesture vocabularies that communicated social status and cultural identity to contemporary viewers. Female figures in Hallstatt art often appear in contexts suggesting religious or ceremonial roles, frequently depicted holding objects including bowls, plants, or geometric symbols that may represent offerings or ritual implements. The artistic treatment of these figures emphasizes their ceremonial functions through distinctive costume elements, including elaborate headdresses, patterned garments, and jewellery configurations that distinguish them from representations of ordinary women. The recurring association of female figures with fertility symbols and agricultural imagery suggests beliefs about feminine roles in maintaining cosmic order and ensuring community prosperity. Male figures in anthropomorphic representations typically appear in warrior contexts, depicted with weapons, armour, and other martial equipment that emphasizes their military functions and social status. The artistic conventions used for warrior imagery include standardized weapon types, shield configurations, and armor styles that provide insights into contemporary military equipment and fighting techniques. However, the symbolic treatment of these martial elements often transcends literal representation, with weapons and armor serving as status indicators and spiritual symbols, rather than simply depicting functional military gear. The decorated metalwork that represents the pinnacle of Hallstatt artistic achievement demonstrates technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication that rivaled contemporary Mediterranean production. The situlae, or bucket-shaped bronze vessels, found in elite burial contexts display complex iconographic programs that combine narrative scenes with decorative elements in carefully orchestrated compositions. These vessels typically feature horizontal registers containing different types of imagery, including processions of human figures, animal friezes and geometric borders that create visual hierarchies and guide viewer attention through the compositional program. The vase situla, discovered in Slovenia and dating to approximately 500 BC, exemplifies the sophisticated narrative complexity achieved in Hallstatt bronze work. The vessel's surface displays multiple registers containing scenes of feasting, ritual activities, and social interactions that provide detailed insights into contemporary cultural practices and social relationships. The upper register depicts a banquet scene with seated figures consuming food and drink from elaborate vessels, while lower registers show musicians, servants, and other participants in ceremonial activities. The artistic execution demonstrates mastery of repousse techniques that created three-dimensional relief effects while maintaining the structural integrity of the bronze vessel. The belt plates that served as personal ornaments for elite individuals display equally sophisticated artistic programs within more constrained compositional formats. These rectangular bronze plaques typically feature symmetrical designs that combine geometric frameworks with figural elements, creating balanced compositions that functioned both as decorative objects and status indicators. The iconographic programs found on belt plates often emphasize themes related to power, protection, and social identity, with recurring motifs including confronted animals, warrior figures, and supernatural beings that proclaimed the wearer's cultural sophistication and social position. The fibulae, or safety pins, used to fasten garments provided opportunities for artistic expression on intimate scales that required exceptional technical precision and aesthetic refinement. The bow fibulae characteristic of the Hallstatt period evolved from simple functional forms into elaborate sculptural objects that incorporated complex decorative programs within highly constrained spatial formats. The artistic treatment of these objects demonstrates sophisticated understanding of proportion and scale relationships, with decorative elements carefully calibrated to remain visually coherent despite their miniature dimensions. Regional artistic variations within the Hallstatt cultural area reflect both local aesthetic preferences and the differential impact of cultural exchanges with contemporary civilizations. The eastern Hallstatt regions, centered around the Austrian Alps and Bohemian highlands, developed artistic traditions that emphasized geometric precision and mathematical harmony, possibly reflecting influences from Scythian artistic traditions transmitted through trade relationships with Black Sea communities. The western regions, with stronger connections to Mediterranean trade networks, incorporated more naturalistic representational elements and showed greater influence from Greek and Etruscan artistic conventions. The evidence for cultural exchange with Greek civilizations appears most clearly in the adoption of specific iconographic motifs and compositional principles that reflect direct contact with Hellenic artistic traditions. Greek pottery found in Hallstatt contexts often displays iconographic programs specifically designed for barbarian consumers, with mythological scenes and decorative elements adapted to Northern European aesthetic preferences. The influence of these imported objects extended beyond simple appreciation to active incorporation of Greek artistic elements into local production, creating hybrid styles that combined Mediterranean sophistication with indigenous cultural content. Etruscan artistic influences appear particularly prominent in bronze working techniques and decorative programs that reflect the advanced metallurgical capabilities of central Italian workshops. The complex casting techniques required for producing elaborate bronze vessels were probably learned through direct contact with Etruscan craftsmen, either through trade relationships or through the movement of skilled workers between cultural areas. The iconographic programs found on Etruscan-influenced objects often emphasized themes related to death and afterlife that complemented indigenous Hallstatt beliefs about proper treatment of the deceased and the continuation of social relationships beyond death. The artistic exchanges with Scythian cultures, mediated through trade networks extending across the Pontic steppes, introduced distinctive animal art styles that emphasized dynamic movement and naturalistic detail within highly stylized compositional frameworks. Scythian artistic influences appear most prominently in the treatment of horse imagery and other animal motifs that reflected the pastoral lifestyle and martial culture of steppe societies. The adaptation of these influences into Hallstatt artistic contexts involved systematic transformation that maintained the dynamic qualities of Scythian animal art while integrating them into local symbolic systems and aesthetic preferences. The symbolic meaning of water birds in Hallstatt visual culture reflects beliefs about spiritual transformation and the connection between terrestrial and celestial realms. Swans, ducks, and other aquatic species appear consistently across different media and contexts, often depicted in association with solar symbols or geometric patterns that suggest their roles as mediators between different cosmic zones. The artistic treatment of water birds typically emphasizes their capacity for flight and their association with water, both elements that may have symbolized spiritual journey and purification in Hallstatt religious thought. The prevalence of solar symbols in Hallstatt decorative arts demonstrates the central importance of sun worship and astronomical observation in contemporary religious practices. Wheel motifs, radial patterns, and other solar imagery appear on objects ranging from personal ornaments to large ceremonial vessels, often combined with other symbolic elements that create complex cosmological statements. The artistic execution of solar symbols frequently involves mathematical precision that suggests knowledge of astronomical relationships and their symbolic significance in representing divine order and cosmic harmony. Warrior imagery in Hallstatt art encompasses both literal representations of military equipment and symbolic expressions of martial values that extended beyond purely military contexts. The artistic treatment of weapons, armour and fighting scenes often emphasises ceremonial and ritual aspects, rather than practical battlefield considerations, suggesting that warrior symbolism served broader cultural functions related to social identity and spiritual power. The recurring association of warrior imagery with other symbolic elements, including animals, solar motifs, and geometric patterns, creates complex iconographic programs that communicate multiple levels of meaning simultaneously. The technical execution of Hallstatt decorative arts required specialized tools and techniques that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of material properties and working methods. The repousse techniques used for bronze decoration involved hammering designs from the reverse side of metal sheets, creating three-dimensional relief effects that required precise control and extensive experience to execute successfully. The engraving techniques used for linear decoration employed specialized tools that could create consistent line weights and depths across complex compositional programs. The evidence for artistic workshops and training systems appears in the consistency of technical execution and stylistic conventions found across different production centres. The standardization of iconographic elements and decorative techniques suggests systematic approaches to artistic education and the transmission of cultural knowledge through formal or informal apprenticeship systems. The presence of unfinished objects and practice pieces in archaeological contexts provides direct evidence of learning processes and the development of technical skills required for professional, artistic production. The integration of artistic programs with functional requirements demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the relationship between aesthetic appeal and practical utility in object design. Decorated vessels maintained structural integrity and functional efficiency, while incorporating complex decorative programs that enhanced their visual impact and cultural significance. The artistic treatment of everyday objects, including tools, weapons, and household items, elevated mundane activities into opportunities for cultural expression and social communication. The preservation of organic materials in exceptional archaeological contexts provides insights into artistic traditions that have otherwise disappeared from the material record. Textile fragments with complex woven patterns demonstrate sophisticated understanding of colour relationships and geometric design principles that complemented the artistic traditions visible in durable materials. Wooden objects with carved decoration reveal artistic capabilities that extended across multiple media and suggest coordinated aesthetic programs that unified different aspects of material culture. The symbolic landscape created by Hallstatt artistic expression encompassed both individual objects and environmental contexts that reinforced cultural messages through coordinated visual programs. The placement of decorated objects within burial contexts, settlement areas, and ritual sites created meaningful relationships between artistic elements and their physical settings that enhanced their communicative power and cultural significance. The cumulative effect of these artistic programs was the creation of visual environments that constantly reinforce social hierarchies, religious beliefs, and cultural identities through sophisticated, symbolic communication systems. The artistic achievements and symbolic sophistication that characterized mature Hallstatt culture were inextricably linked to the extensive trade networks that connected Central European communities to civilizations across the known world. These commercial relationships, far from being simple exchanges of goods for profit, represented complex systems of diplomatic contact, cultural transmission, and technological transfer that fundamentally transformed both Hallstatt society and the broader European landscape. Archaeological evidence reveals trade routes that stretch from the Atlantic coasts of Iberia to the Black Sea steppes, from Scandinavian amber sources to Mediterranean urban centres, creating a web of interconnected relationships that made Hallstatt territories crucial intermediaries in continental commerce. The primary trade corridors that facilitated these exchanges followed natural geographic features that minimised transportation difficulties while connecting disparate cultural regions. The Danube River system provided the fundamental east-west axis for continental trade, with its tributaries offering access to resource-rich highland areas and alternative routes that bypassed political obstacles or seasonal difficulties. The Inn River connected alpine salt-producing regions to the main Danube corridor, while the Salzach and Enns rivers provided additional access routes that distributed trade goods throughout the eastern alpine regions. Archaeological sites along these waterways show consistent evidence of Hallstatt presence through distinctive pottery styles, metalwork traditions, and burial practices that indicate either direct settlement or sustained cultural influence through commercial relationships. The northern trade routes connecting Hallstatt territories to Baltic amber sources required sophisticated coordination between multiple cultural groups and careful management of transportation logistics across varied terrain. These routes typically followed river valleys that provided natural corridors through forested landscapes, with overland segments connecting different watershed systems. The Elbe River offered access to northern German plains and ultimately to Baltic coastal regions, while the Oder and Vistula rivers provided alternative pathways through Polish territories. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hallstatt's own cemetery reveals amber artifacts that had travelled over 1,000 kilometres from their Baltic sources, demonstrating the efficiency and reliability of these long-distance trade networks. The amber trade involved more than simple commodity exchange, encompassing complex relationships between Hallstatt merchants and Baltic communities that produced, processed, and initially distributed this valuable material. Baltic amber, formed from fossilised tree resin over millions of years, occurred in specific geological contexts along the shores of the Baltic Sea, particularly in regions that are now part of Denmark, northern Germany, and the Baltic states. The collection and initial processing of amber required specialised knowledge of coastal conditions, seasonal variations in availability, and techniques for distinguishing high-quality specimens suitable for long-distance trade from inferior materials appropriate only for local use. The processing techniques applied to amber in Baltic contexts involved careful sorting according to size, clarity, and colour characteristics that determine market value in distant regions. Clear amber with minimal inclusions commanded the highest prices, while specimens containing preserved insects or plant materials were prized for their curiosity value and potential magical properties. The working of amber into finished ornaments required specialised tools and techniques that created standardized forms suitable for international trade, including beads of specific sizes and shapes that could be easily incorporated into local jewellery traditions across different cultural areas. Mediterranean trade connections established during this period created some of the most archaeologically visible evidence of Hallstatt commercial relationships, with Greek and Etruscan artefacts found throughout Central European contexts, providing direct testimony to the scale and sophistication of these exchanges. Greek pottery, particularly the fine black figure and red figure vessels produced in Athenian workshops, appears regularly in elite Hallstatt burial contexts, often in association with locally produced grave goods that suggest these imported objects held special significance beyond their practical functions. The iconographic programs found on Greek pottery intended for barbarian markets frequently featured mythological scenes and decorative motifs, specifically selected to appeal to Northern European aesthetic preferences and cultural interests. The massive bronze crater from the Vix burial represents the pinnacle of Mediterranean luxury goods imported into Hallstatt contexts, demonstrating both the purchasing power of salt wealth and the diplomatic significance of these commercial relationships. This extraordinary vessel, standing 1.64 metres in height and weighing over 200 kilograms, required specialised transportation arrangements that involved multiple stages of overland and riverine transport across hundreds of kilometres of varied terrain. The crater's decorative programme, featuring a procession of warriors and chariots around the rim and elaborate handle attachments depicting Gorgon heads, reflects Greek artistic traditions while incorporating elements specifically designed to appeal to barbarian sensibilities regarding martial prowess and supernatural power. Etruscan bronze vessels found in Hallstatt contexts demonstrate equally sophisticated production techniques and reveal the extent to which central Italian workshops adapted their products to meet Northern European market demands. Etruscan bronze buckets, known as situli, incorporated decorative programs that blended Mediterranean artistic traditions with motifs and compositional arrangements that complemented indigenous Hallstatt aesthetic preferences. The technical execution of these vessels required advanced metallurgical knowledge and casting techniques that influenced local bronze-working traditions and contributed to the technological sophistication evident in contemporary Hallstatt metalwork. The coral ornaments found in Hallstatt burial contexts provide evidence of trade connections extending into the western Mediterranean, where coral harvesting occurred along the coasts of southern France, eastern Spain, and northwestern Italy. Mediterranean coral, particularly the red coral species Corallium rubrum, was highly valued for its distinctive colour and believed magical properties that made it suitable for personal ornaments and religious objects. The working of coral required specialised techniques for cutting, shaping and polishing that were probably learned through direct contact with Mediterranean craftsmen or through the movement of skilled workers between cultural regions. The distribution patterns of Mediterranean imports within Hallstatt territories reveal systematic preferences and access hierarchies that reflect both economic capabilities and cultural values. Elite burial contexts consistently contain the highest concentrations of imported goods, with the most elaborate and expensive objects reserved for individuals of the highest social rank. However, Mediterranean imports also appear in contexts associated with craft specialists, merchants, and other non-aristocratic individuals whose professional activities connected them to long-distance trade networks. This distribution pattern suggests that access to foreign goods served as both a marker of social status and a practical requirement for individuals whose economic activities depended on maintaining international relationships. Hallstatt exports to Mediterranean markets included both raw materials and finished goods that took advantage of Central European resource advantages and manufacturing capabilities. Salt represented the primary export commodity, with Mediterranean urban centres requiring reliable supplies for food preservation, industrial processes, and religious ceremonies. The scale of salt exports can be estimated through archaeological evidence of production facilities and transportation infrastructure, that far exceeded local consumption requirements, suggesting annual export volumes measured in thousands of tons of processed salt. Iron and iron products constituted another major category of Hallstatt exports, with Central European smiths developing technical capabilities that produced tools and weapons of exceptional quality. The iron ore deposits of the Eastern Alps contained naturally occurring alloy elements that enhanced the working properties of smelted metal, giving Hallstatt iron products competitive advantages in international markets. Archaeological evidence suggests that iron exports included both raw materials for processing in recipient regions and finished products that demonstrated Hallstatt technological capabilities and manufacturing standards. The evidence for slave trading in Hallstatt commercial networks remains indirect but compelling, based on comparative analysis with contemporary civilizations and the economic logic of long-distance trade relationships. Mediterranean urban centres required substantial labour forces for agricultural, mining and manufacturing activities, while warfare and social conflicts in Central Europe would have produced captive populations suitable for export to distant markets. The wealth accumulation evident in Hallstatt elite contexts exceeds what could reasonably be explained through salt and metal exports alone, suggesting additional revenue sources that could include human trafficking. Amber working within Hallstatt territories demonstrates the value-added processing that characterised sophisticated trade operations and created additional revenue streams from imported raw materials. Baltic amber underwent systematic processing in Hallstatt workshops that transformed raw materials into finished ornaments, designed for both local consumption and re-export to Mediterranean markets. The technical capabilities developed for amber working included drilling techniques for creating beads, carving methods for producing figurative ornaments, and polishing procedures that enhanced the natural beauty of the material. The standardization evident in amber products from Hallstatt contexts suggests systematic production methods and quality control procedures that ensured consistent results across large-scale manufacturing operations. Bead sizes, drilling techniques and surface finishes show remarkable consistency that indicates specialized tools, trained craftsmen and established production protocols. This standardization facilitated trade relationships by creating predictable product characteristics that met the expectations of distant customers and enabled efficient inventory management and pricing calculations. Cultural diffusion resulting from trade relationships extended far beyond simple material exchanges to encompass technological transfer, artistic influences, and religious concepts that fundamentally transformed participating societies. The Mediterranean building techniques employed at the Heuneberg represent direct technological transfer that required either the movement of skilled craftsmen from southern Europe or the training of local workers in foreign construction methods. The mud brick construction techniques used in the Heuneberg fortifications had never before appeared in temperate European contexts and required specialised knowledge of clay preparation, brick formation and wall construction procedures. The artistic influences transmitted through trade networks created hybrid styles that combined elements from multiple cultural traditions while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. Greek decorative motifs appeared on locally produced Hallstatt objects, often adapted and transformed to meet indigenous aesthetic preferences and symbolic requirements. Similarly, Hallstatt artistic elements influenced the production of goods intended for export, creating distinctive styles that appealed to foreign customers while maintaining cultural authenticity. Religious and ceremonial practices show evidence of cross-cultural influence through the adoption of foreign ritual objects and the modification of indigenous ceremonies to incorporate international elements. Mediterranean wine consumption, evidenced by imported amphorae and specialised drinking equipment, may have influenced local religious practices and social customs related to alcohol consumption and ceremonial feasting. The presence of exotic incense materials and ritual objects suggests that religious practices adapted to incorporate foreign elements that enhanced the prestige and effectiveness of traditional ceremonies. Technological transfer through trade relationships encompassed both practical innovations and specialised knowledge that enhanced Hallstatt manufacturing capabilities and economic competitiveness. Pottery production techniques show Mediterranean influences in kiln design, firing procedures, and decorative methods that improved product quality and expanded stylistic possibilities. Metalworking innovations included new alloy compositions, casting techniques, and decorative procedures that were probably learned through direct contact with foreign craftsmen or through systematic observation of imported objects. The diplomatic aspects of trade relationships required sophisticated protocols and institutional arrangements that managed complex international relationships while protecting commercial interests and cultural autonomy. Archaeological evidence suggests that trade negotiations involved formal ceremonies, gift exchanges, and mutual recognition of territorial rights and commercial privileges. The presence of standardized weights and measures in Hallstatt contexts indicates systematic approaches to commercial calculation and the establishment of consistent standards that facilitated transactions across cultural boundaries. Seasonal variations in trade activities reflect both transportation constraints and agricultural cycles that influence the availability of goods and the timing of commercial expeditions. River transportation was most efficient during spring and early summer months when water levels were optimal and weather conditions favoured long-distance travel. Winter months were typically devoted to local production activities and the accumulation of goods for export during the following trading season, creating annual cycles that coordinated production and distribution activities across vast geographic areas. The infrastructure requirements for supporting large-scale trade operations included specialised storage facilities, transportation equipment, and security arrangements that protected valuable goods during transit and storage. Archaeological evidence of large granaries and storage structures within Hallstatt settlements indicates systematic approaches to inventory management and the accumulation of trade goods. Harbour installations and river improvement projects demonstrate investments in transportation infrastructure that facilitated commercial activities and reduced transportation costs. Risk management in long-distance trade involved diversification strategies, insurance arrangements, and security measures that protected commercial investments against various types of loss. The distribution of trade goods across multiple routes and markets reduced dependence on any single commercial relationship, while the establishment of trading partnerships with intermediary communities provided security and logistical support for long-distance expeditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that valuable shipments were often accompanied by armed escorts, and that trading expeditions involved multiple participants who shared both risks and profits. The social implications of extensive trade relationships included the emergence of professional merchant classes, the development of commercial law and customs, and the creation of cosmopolitan cultural attitudes that distinguished trading communities from more isolated agricultural societies. Merchant households showed distinctive material culture patterns that reflect their international connections and economic activities, while burial practices often emphasise portable wealth and exotic goods that could be easily transported and converted into local currencies or trade goods. The extensive trade networks that connected Hallstatt communities to distant civilizations created a complex web of cultural influences that manifested differently across the vast territories where Hallstatt culture took root. Rather than producing uniform cultural expressions, these international connections combined with local, environmental conditions, resource availability, and indigenous traditions to generate distinctive regional variations that reflected the adaptive capacity of Hallstatt societies. The eastern and western zones of Hallstatt influence developed markedly different characteristics in their material culture, settlement organisation, and ritual practices, while maintaining sufficient shared elements to constitute a recognisable cultural phenomenon across Central Europe. The Eastern Hallstatt zone, encompassing the Austrian Alps, Bohemia, Slovakia, and portions of the Carpathian Basin, developed cultural expressions that emphasised geometric precision, sophisticated metallurgy, and burial practices that reflected strong continuities with earlier Urnfield traditions. The communities in these regions maintained closer connections to the original salt-producing territories and demonstrated the most conservative adherence to traditional Hallstatt cultural patterns. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hallstatt itself, Kleinklein in Styria, and BC Skalo in Moravia reveals material culture assemblages that prioritise technical excellence and symbolic complexity over the Mediterranean influences that characterised Western regions. The burial practices in Eastern territories maintained cremation as the predominant mortuary custom throughout most of the Hallstatt period, with elaborate pyre constructions that required substantial community investment and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combustion dynamics. The cremation installations at Magdalenenberg involved carefully engineered fire structures that could maintain temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius for extended periods, ensuring complete reduction of organic materials while preserving metal grave goods in recognisable forms. The ashes and bone fragments were collected with systematic precision, often sorted according to specific criteria that reflected beliefs about the different spiritual components of deceased individuals. The ceramic traditions of Eastern Hallstatt regions developed distinctive decorative vocabularies that emphasised incised geometric patterns, burnished surfaces, and colour contrasts achieved through controlled firing atmospheres. The pottery from Gemeinlebarn in Lower Austria exemplifies these Eastern traditions, with vessels displaying complex arrangements of parallel lines, hatched triangles, and concentric circle motifs that created sophisticated visual rhythms across vessel surfaces. The technical execution of these decorative programs required specialised tools and considerable skill, with potters achieving line widths and spacing consistency that approached mechanical precision. Settlement patterns in eastern regions typically featured hilltop fortifications that controlled strategic positions overlooking river valleys and mountain passes, with defensive architecture that emphasised earth and timber construction rather than the stone and mud brick techniques adopted in western areas. The fortified settlement at Smolenice in Slovakia demonstrates typical eastern defensive strategies, with massive earthwork ramparts reinforced by timber palisades and internal structures that provided protected storage and residential areas. These fortifications incorporated sophisticated engineering principles including drainage systems, access controls, and overlapping defensive lines that created multiple barriers against potential attackers. The metalworking traditions of Eastern Hallstatt communities achieved remarkable technical sophistication, particularly in iron production and the creation of complex bronze objects that demonstrated mastery of advanced casting and finishing techniques. The ironworking sites in the Hüttenberg region of Austria reveal evidence of systematic ore processing, with specialised furnaces that incorporated bellows systems and flux additions that produced high-quality metal suitable for tools and weapons. The bronze workshops associated with these sites created objects that combined functional excellence with elaborate decorative programs, including belt plates, fibulae, and vessel fittings that displayed geometric patterns and stylized animal motifs. The distinctive burial assemblages found in Eastern territories often included wagon components and horse equipment that reflected the continued importance of mobility and pastoral activities in regional economies. The wagon burials at Strettweg and other Austrian sites contained elaborate bronze fittings and iron components that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of vehicle construction and the mechanical requirements for heavy transport. These burial assemblages suggest that elite individuals maintained roles as mobile leaders who could coordinate activities across scattered territories and maintain connections between distant communities. The religious practices evidenced in eastern regions emphasised aquatic deposits and hilltop sanctuaries that reflected beliefs about landscape sacredness and the spiritual significance of prominent topographic features. The massive weapon deposits at sites like Duchkov contained thousands of objects that had been systematically damaged before deposition, suggesting ritual protocols that killed metal objects to transfer their spiritual essence to supernatural realms. These deposits often occurred at spring sources or river confluences that served as natural gathering places for communities scattered across large territories. The Western Hallstatt zone, stretching across eastern France, Switzerland, southwestern Germany, and portions of the Low Countries, developed cultural expressions that demonstrated stronger Mediterranean influences and greater innovation in architectural techniques, artistic styles, and social organisation. The communities in these regions occupied strategic positions along major trade routes connecting Central Europe to Mediterranean markets, creating opportunities for intensive cultural exchange that influenced every aspect of material culture. Archaeological sites like the Hüneberg, Mont-Lassois, and Châtillon-sur-Glane reveal material assemblages that blended indigenous traditions with foreign innovations in distinctive synthetic styles. The architectural achievements of Western Hallstatt communities represented revolutionary developments in European building technology, with construction techniques that incorporated Mediterranean innovations while adapting them to local environmental conditions and cultural preferences. The mud brick fortifications at the Hüneberg required specialised knowledge of clay preparation, brick formation, and wall construction that had never before appeared in temperate European contexts. The builders modified Mediterranean techniques to account for local climate conditions, including freeze-thaw cycles that could damage inadequately protected masonry and precipitation patterns that required enhanced drainage systems. The residential architecture within Western settlements demonstrated sophisticated understanding of comfort and convenience that reflected both Mediterranean influences and local innovations in heating, ventilation, and interior organisation. Elite houses at the Hüneberg incorporated hypocaust heating systems adapted from Roman prototypes, with underground channels that distributed warm air throughout multi-room structures during cold seasons. The interior arrangements included specialised spaces for different activities, with dedicated areas for food preparation, craft production, and social entertainment that reflected increasingly complex household organisation. The pottery traditions of Western regions incorporated Mediterranean influences in both technical execution and decorative programmes, with local workshops producing vessels that combined indigenous forms with foreign stylistic elements. The ceramics from Châtillon-sur-Glane display sophisticated understanding of surface treatments and firing techniques that created lustrous finishes and controlled colour effects. The decorative programmes often incorporated painted motifs derived from Greek pottery traditions, adapted to local aesthetic preferences and symbolic requirements. The burial practices in Western territories showed greater variation and innovation than Eastern regions, with increasing adoption of inhumation customs that may have reflected Mediterranean influences or local developments in beliefs about death and afterlife. The princely burials at sites like Wix and Hochdorf involved the construction of elaborate wooden chambers beneath massive earthen mounds, with grave goods that demonstrated the global reach of Western trade networks. These burials contained Mediterranean imports, including bronze vessels, coral ornaments, and silk textiles that had travelled thousands of kilometres from their production centres. The metalworking traditions of Western communities emphasised decorative sophistication and technical innovation rather than the geometric precision that characterised Eastern production. Bronze vessels from Western workshops often incorporated narrative scenes and complex iconographic programmes that reflected both local mythological traditions and foreign artistic influences. The situlae produced in workshops associated with settlements like Klein-Klein displayed sophisticated repousse techniques that created three-dimensional relief effects while maintaining structural integrity in functional vessels. The interaction patterns between Hallstatt communities and contemporary cultures varied significantly according to geographic position and the specific cultural groups encountered along different trade routes and territorial boundaries. The Eastern Hallstatt regions maintained extensive contacts with Scythian cultures through trade networks that extended across the Pontic steppes. creating opportunities for cultural exchange that influenced artistic styles, military equipment, and pastoral practices. Archaeological evidence of Scythian influences appears in the animal art styles found on bronze objects and the horse equipment discovered in elite burial contexts. The Scythian artistic traditions that influenced Eastern Hallstatt communities emphasized dynamic animal representations and sophisticated metalworking techniques that created distinctive visual effects through contrasting textures and surface treatments. The animal-style motifs found on Hallstatt belt plates and fibulae demonstrate systematic adaptation of Scythian artistic conventions to local aesthetic preferences and symbolic requirements. These influences appear most prominently in the treatment of horse imagery and predator animals that reflected the martial culture and pastoral lifestyle of steppe societies. The military equipment found in Eastern Hallstatt contexts shows evidence of technological exchange with Scythian cultures, particularly in archery equipment and horse gear that reflected the mounted warfare techniques developed on the steppes. The presence of specialized arrowheads and bow components in burial assemblages suggests that some Hallstatt warriors adopted Scythian military innovations, though these remained secondary to traditional Central European fighting methods that emphasized close combat with swords and spears. The Western Hallstatt regions maintained more intensive relationships with Mediterranean civilizations, creating opportunities for direct cultural contact that influenced architectural techniques, artistic styles, and social customs. Greek and Etruscan merchants established trading relationships that involved regular contact between Mediterranean and Central European communities, facilitating the transfer of technological knowledge and cultural practices. The presence of Mediterranean craftsmen in Western Hallstatt settlements is suggested by archaeological evidence of foreign building techniques and specialized production methods that required expert knowledge. The Greek influences evident in Western Hallstatt culture encompassed both material objects and cultural practices that reflected systematic adoption of Hellenic customs and technologies. Wine consumption, evidenced by imported amphorae and specialized drinking equipment, may have influenced local social customs and religious practices related to ceremonial feasting and elite entertainment. The iconographic programs found on imported Greek pottery often featured mythological scenes specifically selected to appeal to barbarian sensibilities regarding heroic behavior and supernatural power. Etruscan cultural influences appear particularly prominent in bronze-working techniques and funerary practices that reflected the sophisticated material culture of central Italian cities. The complex casting techniques required for producing elaborate bronze vessels were probably learned through direct contact with Etruscan workshops, either through trade relationships or through the movement of skilled craftsmen between cultural regions. The burial customs found in Western territories often incorporated Etruscan elements, including specific gravegood arrangements and ceremonial practices that complemented indigenous traditions. The Atlantic Bronze Age cultures of Western Europe maintained trade relationships with Hallstatt communities that facilitated the exchange of raw materials, finished goods, and technological knowledge across vast distances. The tin deposits of Cornwall and Brittany remained essential for bronze production despite the increasing importance of iron technology, creating ongoing commercial relationships that connected Hallstatt territories to Atlantic coastal regions. Archaeological evidence of these connections appears in the distribution of distinctive bronze objects and the presence of Atlantic cultural influences in Western Hallstatt material culture. The amber trade networks that connected Baltic regions to Central Europe created opportunities for cultural exchange with Northern European societies that influenced Hallstatt artistic traditions and religious practices. The processing techniques applied to Baltic amber in Hallstatt workshops demonstrate sophisticated understanding of this material's properties and the aesthetic preferences of different market regions. The symbolic significance of amber in Hallstatt culture may have reflected beliefs about its magical properties and its association with solar symbolism and spiritual transformation. Local adaptations of Hallstatt cultural elements reflected the diverse environmental conditions and resource availability that characterized different regions within the broader cultural area. Alpine communities developed specialized knowledge of mineral extraction and processing that took advantage of local geological conditions, while lowland settlements focused on agricultural production and river transportation networks. These environmental adaptations created regional variations in economic organization and material culture that maintained cultural coherence while reflecting local circumstances. The mountainous terrain of the eastern Alpine regions required specialized settlement strategies and architectural techniques that could accommodate steep slopes, seasonal weather variations, and limited agricultural land. The terrace settlements found in these areas demonstrate sophisticated understanding of slope stability and drainage management, with construction techniques that minimized erosion and maximized usable space. The defensive advantages provided by mountainous terrain influenced military strategies and settlement organization patterns that differed significantly from lowland approaches. The river valley environments that characterized much of the Hallstatt cultural area provided natural transportation corridors and fertile agricultural land that supported dense populations and intensive economic activities. The communities positioned along major waterways developed specialized knowledge of river navigation, seasonal flooding patterns, and the transportation logistics required for long-distance trade. The harbour installations and river improvement projects found at these sites demonstrate systematic approaches to infrastructure development that facilitated commercial activities. The forest resources that dominated much of Central Europe during the Hallstatt period provided essential materials for construction, fuel, and craft production while creating environments that required specialized management techniques. The evidence for systematic forestry practices includes selective harvesting patterns that maintain timber supplies while providing agricultural land and grazing areas for livestock. The woodworking capabilities developed by Hallstatt communities reflected sophisticated understanding of different wood species and their appropriate applications for specific construction requirements. The agricultural adaptations developed by Hallstatt communities reflected both environmental constraints and the economic opportunities created by trade relationships and population concentrations. The crop rotation systems evidenced by paleobotanical analysis demonstrate knowledge of soil management techniques that maintained fertility while maximizing yields from available land. The integration of livestock raising with cereal cultivation created agricultural systems that provided diverse food sources while supporting craft production through the provision of raw materials, including wool, leather, and bone. The sophisticated agricultural systems and regional adaptations that had sustained Hallstatt prosperity for over 2 centuries began showing signs of strain by 500 BC as a combination of environmental pressures, political upheavals, and cultural transformations initiated fundamental changes that would ultimately transform the entire Central European landscape. The decline of traditional Hallstatt elite culture did not occur as a sudden collapse, but rather as a gradual process of adaptation and transformation that reflected both internal social tensions and external pressures from expanding populations and shifting trade networks. Climate data from alpine ice cores and pollen analysis indicates a period of cooling and increased precipitation beginning around 520 BC that significantly impacted agricultural productivity and settlement patterns across the Hallstatt cultural area. The deteriorating weather conditions reduced crop yields and shortened growing seasons, creating food shortages that undermined the economic foundations of elite power structures. The massive earthwork fortifications and elaborate ceremonial centres that had characterised the mature Hallstatt period required substantial agricultural surpluses to support their non-productive populations, making these communities particularly vulnerable to environmental stress. The Heuneberg provides compelling archaeological evidence for the impact of these environmental changes on elite settlement systems. Excavations reveal evidence of systematic abandonment beginning around 480 BC, with valuable objects hastily buried and defensive structures left incomplete. the Mediterranean-style mud brick fortifications showed extensive damage from freeze-thaw cycles that the original builders had not adequately anticipated, while storage areas contained evidence of depleted grain reserves that suggest the community could no longer sustain its concentrated population during difficult seasons. Political instability accompanied environmental stress as traditional authority structures proved inadequate for managing the complex challenges facing Hallstatt communities. The salt trade networks that had provided the economic foundation for elite power began fragmenting as alternative sources and routes reduced dependence on alpine production centres. Archaeological evidence from trading sites along the Danube corridor shows declining quantities of Hallstatt goods and increasing presence of materials from other cultural regions, indicating that commercial relationships were shifting toward new centres of production and distribution. The warrior culture that had provided an alternative source of elite legitimacy also underwent fundamental transformations as military technologies and tactical systems evolved beyond traditional Hallstatt capabilities. The emergence of Latène military equipment, characterised by longer swords designed for mounted combat and distinctive shield configurations optimised for new fighting techniques, represented technological innovations that rendered traditional Hallstatt weapons and armour obsolete. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits shows the deliberate destruction of older equipment types and their replacement with new forms that reflected changing military requirements. Social tensions within Hallstatt communities intensified as economic difficulties undermined traditional relationships between elite households and their dependent populations. The craft specialists, miners, and agricultural workers who had supported elite consumption patterns began asserting greater independence as alternative economic opportunities emerged through direct participation in evolving trade networks. Archaeological evidence from workshop areas shows increasing standardization of production techniques and the development of specialized tools that suggest craft workers were organizing independent production systems rather than remaining dependent on elite patronage. The burial evidence from this transitional period reveals dramatic changes in mortuary practices that reflected broader social transformations. The massive princely burials that had characterized the mature Hallstatt period became increasingly rare after 500 BC, replaced by smaller grave assemblages that emphasized portable wealth and personal equipment rather than massive displays of imported luxury goods. The Dürnberg cemetery in Austria demonstrates these changing patterns, with later burials containing locally produced objects of high technical quality, but lacking the Mediterranean imports that had dominated earlier elite assemblages. Religious practices underwent equally significant transformations as traditional ceremonial centres lost their central roles in community organisation and new forms of spiritual expression emerged. The hilltop sanctuaries that had served as focal points for territorial religious activities show evidence of abandonment or radical modification, with ritual deposits becoming smaller and more localised rather than representing the massive community investments characteristic of earlier periods. Archaeological evidence suggests that religious authority became more dispersed, with smaller communities developing independent ceremonial traditions rather than participating in centralised ritual systems. Artistic expression during the transitional period reflected the cultural synthesis that would characterise the emerging Latène style, combining traditional Hallstatt geometric traditions with new motifs and compositional principles derived from evolving cultural contacts. The curvilinear patterns that would become diagnostic of Latène art began appearing on objects from late Hallstatt contexts, often combined with traditional geometric elements in hybrid styles that demonstrated ongoing cultural experimentation. The famous Voldalgersheim chariot fittings exemplify these transitional artistic expressions, incorporating flowing plant motifs and abstract patterns that departed significantly from earlier Hallstatt decorative vocabularies. Settlement patterns underwent fundamental reorganisation, as the fortified hilltop centres that had dominated the Hallstatt landscape were abandoned in favour of new site types that reflected changing economic and social priorities. Many communities relocated to valley floor positions that provided better access to agricultural land and transportation networks, abandoning the defensive advantages of elevated sites in favour of economic opportunities. The new settlements typically featured dispersed residential arrangements rather than the concentrated populations characteristic of earlier fortified centres, suggesting changes in social organisation and community structure. Technological innovation accelerated during this transitional period as communities adapted to changing circumstances through the development of new production techniques and material culture forms. Ironworking technology underwent significant advances with the development of improved smelting techniques that produced higher quality steel and more efficient production methods that reduced costs and increased output. The lateen sword-making tradition that emerged during this period incorporated sophisticated metallurgical knowledge that created weapons with superior performance characteristics compared to traditional Hallstatt equipment. Pottery production systems adapted to changing market conditions through the development of new vessel forms and decorative styles that reflected evolving cultural preferences and functional requirements. The wheel-thrown pottery that became characteristic of lateen culture required different technical skills and production equipment compared to traditional Hallstatt hand-building techniques, representing a fundamental shift in ceramic technology. These innovations enabled more efficient production and created opportunities for specialised pottery workshops to serve broader market areas. Trade network reorganisation accompanied these technological and social changes as new commercial centres emerged to replace the declining Hallstatt trading posts. The oppidum sites that would become characteristic of lateen culture began developing during this transitional period, often positioned to control strategic river crossings or resource extraction areas that had been peripheral to earlier Hallstatt territories. Archaeological evidence from early lateen trading centres shows material culture assemblages that combine traditional Central European elements with new influences from Mediterranean and Northern European sources. Cultural continuity persisted despite these dramatic transformations, with many fundamental aspects of Hallstatt tradition continuing to influence lateen development in modified forms. The aquatic ritual deposits that had characterised Hallstatt religious practice continued throughout the lateen period, though often with different object types and depositional contexts that reflected evolving ceremonial requirements. The famous lateen site itself demonstrates this continuity, with weapon deposits spanning several centuries and incorporating both traditional Hallstatt equipment types and new lateen forms. Metalworking traditions maintained strong connections between Hallstatt and lateen cultures, with many technical innovations and artistic motifs showing clear developmental relationships across the cultural transition. The sophisticated bronze-working capabilities developed during the Hallstatt period provided the technical foundation for lateen artistic achievements, while the organisational systems that had supported specialised craft production continued to operate under modified social and economic arrangements. Regional variations in the transition process reflected the diverse circumstances and cultural influences that characterised different parts of the former Hallstatt territories. Eastern regions maintained stronger continuities with traditional practices, often incorporating lateen innovations within essentially conservative cultural frameworks that preserved many Hallstatt characteristics. Western areas underwent more dramatic transformations that reflected their greater exposure to Mediterranean influences and their positions along evolving trade routes that connected Central Europe to expanding Celtic territories. The Marne region of eastern France exemplifies the Western transformation process, with archaeological sites showing rapid adoption of lateen material culture forms and burial practices that departed significantly from earlier Hallstatt traditions. The chariot burials that became characteristic of early lateen elite culture in this region incorporated new vehicle technologies and ceremonial practices, while maintaining underlying concepts about elite status and proper treatment of the dead that derived from Hallstatt precedents. Bohemian territories demonstrate the Eastern pattern of gradual adaptation, with lateen innovations appearing alongside continuing Hallstatt traditions in archaeological contexts that suggest selective adoption rather than wholesale cultural replacement. The Zavist oppidum near Prague shows evidence of continuous occupation spanning the Hallstatt transition, with material culture assemblages that document the gradual evolution of traditional practices rather than abrupt cultural change. Population movements during this transitional period contributed to cultural mixing and the spread of innovations across traditional territorial boundaries. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities migrated from declining Hallstatt centres to establish new settlements in previously peripheral areas, carrying technological knowledge and cultural practices that influence local development patterns. These population movements may have accelerated the transmission of Latena innovations, while creating opportunities for cultural synthesis in new territorial contexts. The Celtic expansion that would characterise the following centuries had its origins in these transitional processes, as communities developed new organisational capabilities and cultural identities that enabled territorial expansion and cultural influence across vast areas of Europe. The military technologies, artistic traditions, and social organisation systems that emerged during the Hallstatt transition provided the cultural toolkit that supported subsequent Celtic achievements in Gaul, Iberia, the British Isles, and other regions far from the Central European heartland. Economic systems underwent fundamental restructuring as communities adapted to changing trade patterns and resource availability. The centralised control over salt production and distribution that had characterised Hallstatt elite power gave way to more diversified economic strategies that emphasised agricultural production, craft specialisation, and participation in evolving commercial networks. Archaeological evidence suggests that economic authority became more distributed, with successful merchants and craft specialists achieving social positions that had previously been reserved for traditional territorial elites. The legacy of Hallstatt culture extended far beyond its immediate chronological boundaries, influencing European development through technological innovations, artistic traditions, and social organisation concepts that continue to shape cultural evolution throughout the Iron Age and into the Roman period. The ironworking techniques developed during the Hallstatt period provided the metallurgical foundation for subsequent European technological development, while the artistic traditions established during this era continued to influence decorative arts across Celtic territories for centuries. Urban planning concepts pioneered at sites like the Huneberg influenced the development of later Celtic oppida and Roman urban foundations, with architectural techniques and settlement organisation principles that demonstrated the lasting impact of Hallstatt innovations. The integration of defensive, residential, and commercial functions within planned urban environments represented a fundamental advance in European settlement organisation that continued to influence urban development long after the decline of Hallstatt culture itself. Religious and ceremonial traditions established during the Hallstatt period continued to influence Celtic spiritual practices throughout their historical development, with aquatic deposits, hilltop sanctuaries, and elaborate burial customs maintaining central roles in Celtic religious expression. The symbolic vocabularies developed during the Hallstatt period provided important elements for subsequent Celtic artistic and religious traditions, demonstrating the fundamental cultural continuities that connected prehistoric and historic European civilizations. The transformation of Hallstatt culture into Latini traditions represents one of the most significant cultural transitions in European prehistory, marking the emergence of the Celtic civilization that would dominate much of the continent for the following 5 centuries. Rather than representing a simple replacement of one culture by another, this transition involved complex processes of adaptation, innovation, and cultural synthesis that preserved essential elements of Hallstatt achievement while creating new forms of expression appropriate to changing circumstances. The Hallstatt culture's greatest legacy lay not in its specific material forms or social institutions, but in its demonstration of Central Europe's capacity for cultural innovation and adaptation that would continue to characterise European development throughout subsequent periods of historical change,